The afternoon sun hung low over the western ridges of the Rhine Valley, casting long, amber-hued ribbons of light across a landscape frozen in a moment of quiet transition. It was the year 900, a time when the rhythms of the earth dictated every breath of human existence, and the shifting of the seasons carried the weight of survival. Along the sweeping bends of the great river, the water moved with a slow, heavy deliberation, its surface mirroring the pale blue of the autumn sky and the darkening silhouettes of the forested hillsides. The summer had withdrawn its vibrant green mantle, leaving behind a world painted in shades of russet, copper, and pale gold. On a high ridge overlooking the wide basin of the agricultural manor, two figures stood completely motionless, watching the day's final light recede from the valleys below. Old Aldous, the estate's seasoned swineherd, stood with his gnarled hands resting heavily upon a long stave of seasoned ash wood. Beside him stood young Bruno, his apprentice, whose eyes tracked the drifting flight of a lone bird circling high above the timbered roofs of the settlement. The wind that swept across the ridge carried a distinct, crisp sharpness, a silent messenger from the northern plains signaling the definitive end of the harvest moon. Below them, the vast, open meadows of the estate lay quiet and empty. For months, these common pastures had nourished the village livestock, but now the grass was thin, brittle, and drained of its vital juices by the early frost. The earth here was tired, compacted by the tread of many hooves, and its ability to sustain the community's herds had reached its natural limit. Aldous observed the pale, dry stalks of clover rustling softly in the breeze, knowing that the soil would soon be locked in a silent embrace of ice. Yet, his face bore no sign of haste or agitation. His eyes, framed by deep lines carved by decades of outdoor life, turned away from the barren fields and settled upon the immense, dark wall of the ancient forest that bordered the northeastern edge of the manor lands. It was a primeval realm of oak and beech tree, whose massive trunks had stood for centuries, witnessing the rise and fall of kingdoms. While the fields below were bare, the great forest was heavy with a hidden abundance, a secret treasury of the earth that was about to open its gates to the village. The air between the trees was thick with the scent of damp loam, decaying bark, and the rich, starky perfume of fallen acorns. The great oak canopy, though thinning, still held a vast dome of bronze and gold leaves that whispered softly under the pressure of the autumn wind. The contrast between the empty pastures and the wealthy woodland was stark, a reminder of the delicate balance the medieval community maintained with the natural world. Bruno felt the chill of the evening creeping through his heavy wool cloak, yet the sight of the old man's calm posture brought a sense of stability. They watched together as the first thin columns of pale grey smoke began to rise from the thatched hearths of the distant village huts, curling lazily in the cooling air. The work of the harvest fields was finished, the grain barns were shut, and the stone mills had slowed their steady grinding. Now, the destiny of the manor's economy shifted away from the ploughed furrows and toward the untamed depth of the ancient woods. It was a transition that required patience, an intimate knowledge of the forest floor, and a profound respect for the customary rights that allowed humans to share in the bounty of the wild trees. The shadows grew longer, stretching like dark fingers across the valley floor, swallowing the river banks and the wooden fences of the livestock pens. The great water wheel of the manor lord's mill stood still, its wooden paddies dripping slowly in the dark pool below. The world was slowing down, retreating in the quiet shelter of the evening. Aldous raised his ash stave slightly, pointing toward the dense tree line where the ancient oaks stood like silent sentinels of time. Tomorrow, the great migration in the woods would begin, a journey not of conquest or labor, but of harmonious gathering under the golden dome of the forest. The early morning light that crept over the high timber palisades of the manor was pale and thin, stripped of the golden warmth that had defined the late summer weeks. A quiet stillness hung over the settlement, interrupted only by the occasional creak of a wooden gate swaying, in the cold northern breeze or the distant, rhythmic chop of an axe-splitting firewood for the kitchen hearths. Inside the thick, earth-walled longhouses, the air carried the lingering scent of oak smoke, dried sage, and salted tallow. In the central storehouse of the estate, Mistress Sizzle moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her heavy wool skirt brushing against the parquet floor as she inspected the community's remaining provisions. Her fingers, weathered by decades of spinning wool and kneading rye dough, ran thoughtfully over the coarse surface of the braided willow baskets and the rough, hewn oak barrels that lined the dark perimeter of the larder. The inventory was a silent testament to the changing of the guard between the seasons. There were sacks of dried field peas, jars of dark forest honey, and heavy wheels of hard cheese wrapped in oil-soaked linen, all meticulously arranged to withstand the coming months of frost. Yet, as she stood near the high, narrow ventilation slit that allowed a sliver of grey light to pierce the gloom, her eyes wandered past the safety of the stone granary toward the open valley. The view was sobering. The expansive communal meadows, which only a month ago had been a rolling sea of vibrant green clover and sweet grass, had faded into dull, uniform shade of iron grey and brittle brown. The seasonal transformation of the pasture land was complete. The rich nutrients had retreated deep in the frozen earth, leaving by nothing but hollow stalks that rattled like dry bones whenever the wind swept down from the hillsides. For the manor's livestock, particularly the large herd of domestic swine upon which the village depended for its winter sustenance, this environment depletion posed an immediate and silent crisis. In their wooden pens near the edge of the stream, the animals stood in quiet clusters, their coarse, bristly coats shivering slightly in the damp morning mist. These were not the docile, heavy-bodied creatures of modern times, but the lean, hardy medieval breeds, direct descendants of the wild forest boars, possessing sharp instincts, long legs, and an insatiable need for foraging. Their low, questioning grunts drift across the quiet lanes of the village, a soft but persistent reminder of their empty bellies. If the animals remained confined to the exhausted lowland pastures, they would rapidly lose the precious layers of fat they had accumulated over the summer, entering the cruel winter months weak, vulnerable, and depleted. Gisela understood this economic reality with the profound clarity of a woman who had seen many winters come and go. Every ounce of weight lost by the herd was a direct threat to the safety and warmth of the village families when the snows eventually blocked the valley roads. She watched from the storehouse threshold as a thin layer of morning rime frost began to crystallize along the top rails of the pig pens, turning the dark, damp wood into sparkling ribbons of white ice. The air she exhaled formed small, fleeting clouds of vapor that vanished in the chilly atmosphere. There was no panic in her demeanor, only the steady, enduring patience that characterized the agrarian life of the 10th century. She knew that the barrenness of the fields was not the end of the story, but merely the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The true hope of the manor lay not in the cleared fields or the withered meadows, but in the dark, majestic wall of trees that dominated the horizon. while the lowlands struggled under the first touch of winter's icy breath. The great ancient forest was entering its period of greatest generosity. As Gisela stepped out in the courtyard, adjusting her heavy wool shawl tightly round her shoulders, she saw old Aldous and young Bruno preparing their simple gear near the tool sheds. The anxiety that had quietly settled over the village was tempered by a deep, foundation trust in the ancient cycles of the earth and the customary laws that bound the human community to the surrounding wilderness. The fading of the summer pastures was a necessary prelude, a cold hand guiding the steps of the herdsmen away from the valleys and in the sheltering embrace of the great oak groves. The border where the cleared fields of the manor met the rising tide of the ancient forest was marked by a series of low, grey boundary stones, moss-covered and half-buried under decades of fallen foliage. These stones, placed by ancestral hands long before the current lord's great-grandfather had claimed the valley, served as a gentle threshold between the domestic world of humans and the timeless realm of the wild timber. To an outsider, the vast expanse of the early medieval forest might have seemed like an intimidating wilderness, an endless sea of dark shadows and unknown paths. But to the people of the Rhine Valley, and especially to old Aldous, this woodland was not a place of fear or hostility. It was a sacred sanctuary, a protective green wall that shielded the village from the harsh northern winds and offered a boundless bounty to those who knew how to ask for it with respect. As the morning sun slowly climbed higher in the pale autumn sky, Aldous and Bruno walked along this ancient boundary line, their soft leather boots pressing silently in the damp, leafy carpet. The air grew perceptibly cooler as they approached the tree line, filled with the deep, ground aroma of wet earth, decaying wood, and the bitter fragrance of wild ferns. Aldous stopped beside a massive, low, branching oak tree whose trunk was so wide that 4 grown men could not have clasped hands around it. The old man placed his open palm against the rough, deeply furrowed bark, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of the living timber. He looked down at Bruno, his voice a low, steady murmur that seemed to harmonize with the rustling canopy above, and began to explain the ancient, unwritten laws that governed this landscape. These were the customary rites of the forest, traditions passed down through generations by word of mouth, far older than any ink-written decree on parchment. Aldous told the boy of the great legal heritage of the woodland, known in their traditional tongue as the rite of Pannage, or the custom of the massed grazing. It was a communal understanding that guaranteed the common folk access to the forest floor during the autumn months, allowing their herds to feast upon the abundant harvest of the oaks and beeches. This was not a gift given out of charity by the manor lord, but a foundation law of survival, a reckoned partnership between the estate, the peasants, and the earth itself. The forest was viewed as a vast, natural pantry, its resource carefully managed so that no single village would deplete its riches, ensuring that the trees remained healthy and vibrant for the children yet unborn. Bruno listened intently, his fingers tracing the delicate patterns of a fallen oak leaf that had come to rest upon a cushion of emerald green moss. He looked in the depths of the forest, observing how the massive trunks stretched out in seemingly endless rows, creating a natural architecture of columns and arches that rivaled the grandest stone halls of the distant towns. The light that filtered through the high, interconnected branches was soft, diffused, and golden, casting long, peaceful shadows across the forest floor. There was a profound sense of order here, a quiet intelligence that governed the sprouting of every acorn and the decay of every fallen branch. The forest did not rush, it operated on a scale of centuries. its steady growth unaffected by the fleeting anxieties of human politics or the temporary scarcity of the valley pastures. The two herdsmen stood at the gates of this ancient kingdom, feeling the deep peace that emanated from the silent trees. They knew that within this wooded sanctuary, their herd would find the nourishment denied to them by the frozen meadows below. The great oak stood ready, their branches laden with millions of rich, brown acorns that were already beginning to detach and tumble softly through the crisp autumn air. It was time to cross the threshold, to leave behind the open spaces of the valley and immerse themselves in the rhythmic, sheltering life of the primeval woods. The channel is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. The early light began to define the physical geometry of the Carolingian area state, illuminating a landscape built entirely from the raw, unyielding materials of the surrounding earth. This manor was not a grand monument of polished marble or sterile stone, but a living, breathing assembly of timber, thatch, and hand-hewn rock, weathered by decades of changing seasons and integrated seamlessly in the contours of the valley terrain. At the heart of the settlement stood the Lord's Great Hall, a massive structure built of dark, ancient oak logs that had been split by hand and squared with the steady, practiced strokes of iron adzes. The surface of these timbers was rough to touch, retaining the deep, natural furrows of the tree's original grain and the silver-grey patina that only comes from years of exposure to the damp river air of the Rhine Valley. Each pillar that supported the heavy timber roof was a monument to early medieval craftsmanship, sunk deep in the earth and anchored securely by layers of tightly packed river clay and small flint stones. Looking upward, the roofs of the longhouses and cottages present a vast, undulating surface of thick rye thatch, woven with meticulous care by the village elders during the dry days of the late summer harvest. The straw had now settled into dense, insulating blanket nearly 2 feet deep, designed to protect the families below from both the summer heat and the winter frost. In the dampness of the autumn dawn, the thatch held a heavy, dark hue, its millions of individual stalks glistening with thousands of microscopic droplets of rime frost. The scent of this material was comforting and deep, a rich mixture of dried field grasses, sweet clover, and the faint, sweet aroma of wood smoke that had filtered upward through the fibres over countless nights. There were no stone chimneys in these traditional dwellings. Instead, the pale blue smoke from the central hearths drifted slowly through the porous thatch, curling lazily in the cold morning air like the collective breath of the houses themselves. Along the base of the structures, where the heavy wooden walls met the damp earth, ran a solid foundation of fieldstones and river rocks. These stones, gathered one by one from the gravel bars of the Rhine and the cleared furrows of the agricultural plots, were fit together with a primid but durable mortar made of sand, lime, and crushed straw. They were cool to the touch, their smooth, water-rounded surfaces painted in varying shades of slate grey, pale granite, and iron red. These stone foundations provided a vital barrier against the rising moisture of the lowlands, keeping the great oak, sill, timbers dry and ensuring that the homes remained stable through generations of frost heaves and spring floods. Between the vertical timber posts, the walls were filled with wattle and daub, a traditional weave of flexible hazel branches covered in a thick plaster of clay, straw, and animal hair, smoothed over by hand and washed with white lime to reflect the precious daylight. As the village slowly began to stir, the architectural textures became alive with subtle movement. Heavy wooden doors, carved from solid planks of wild cherry and bound with thick straps of dark, hand-forged iron, creaked open on their seasoned leather hinges. The sound was low and resonant, echoing softly off the timber walls of the neighbouring grain barns and tool sheds. From within the dark interiors, the warm, orange glow of the morning fires began to flicker through the small, parchment-covered window openings, casting a soft, translucid light onto the frosted paths outside. The community woke not to the sudden clang of metal or the rush of modern life, but to the gentle, rhythmic sounds of wood touching wood, the soft scraping of a wooden shovel against a stone hearth, and the low, companional murmurs of the morning chores. Every building on the manor grounds, from the grandest barn to the humblest livestock shelter, was a physical manifestation of human ingenuity working in absolute harmony with the natural resource of the landscape, creating a space of warmth, endurance, and quiet security in the face of the encroaching winter. The transition of the medieval landscape intensified as a powerful, invisible currents of air began to flow directly from the northern seas, sweeping down the long spine of the Rhine Valley with a steady, cooling breath. This the first true whisper of the autumn frost, a meteorological shift that signalled the definitive closure of the agrarian year and the arrival of a quieter, more reflective epoch for the natural world. The wind did not arrive with the violent fury of a winter blizzard, but rather as a persistent ice sigh that moved across the open fields, lifting the loose straw from the thatch roofs and setting the dry stalks of the harvested rye into a low, rhythmic murmur, as this northern air mass collided with the warmer, moisture-laden air rising from the slow-moving river. A thin, crystalline veil of rime began to settle over the entire valley, transforming the visual textures of the landscape before the sun could fully clear the eastern horizons. Now here was this atmospheric transformation more spectacular or profound than within the high, undulating canopy of the ancient oak forest. The great woodland, which had stood as a solid will of deep, monotonous summer green for months, was rapidly undergoing a marvellous and complex alchemy of colour. The chemical withdrawal of life from the outer tips of the branches down into the deep, protected root systems of the giant trees manifest as a brilliant explosion of shades. The highest crowns of the centuries, old oak, which received the first and most direct contact with the freezing night air, were the first to surrender their summer attire. They transformed into brilliant crests of pale gold and shimmering amber, catching the early morning sunlight like burning torches held high above the valley floor. Below these golden crests, the deeper layers of the foliage transitioned into rich, heavy tones of rustic red, deep copper, and metallic bronze. The transformation was not uniform, it occurred in beautiful, slow-moving waves that track the paths of the cold draughts through the woodland architecture. A single massive oak tree might display a breathtaking gradient of life, with its northern-facing branches completely turned to a brittle, chocolate brown, while its southern flank still held onto stubborn, pale yellow-green. The leaves themselves, dried by the crisp air and hardened by the nightly frost, lost their supple flexibility. They became delicate, paper-like structures that rustled with a clean, sharp sound whenever the wind brushed against them. This collective rustling produced a continuous, soothing white noise that filled the interior of the forest, a soft, cascading murmur that sounded like the distant falling of gentle summer rain. With the arrival of the frost, the physical bond between the leaves and the twigs began to loosen, as the morning slowly warmed the air, melting the delicate frost crystals in microscopic drops of water that glided down the bark. Thousands of leaves began their final, graceful descent to the earth. They did not fall in a sudden, chaotic storm, but one by one, drifting through the multi-layered canopy with a slow, spiraling motion that seemed to defy the pull of gravity. A single oak leaf would detach from a high branch, tilt gently on the air currents, catch a sliver of morning light, and flip gracefully before landing silently upon the deep, velvety cushions of moss below. This steady, uninterrupted rain of gold and bronze was completing the creation of a thick, insulating carpet over the forest floor, a rich tapestry that would soon provide both shelter for the subterranean life and an abundant feast for the incoming manor herd. Young Bruno, standing at the edge of the woods, watched this magnificent display of natural impermanence with a sense of quiet wonder. The very air felt different, sharper, cleaner, and filled with a pristine clarity that allowed the eye to see deep in the woodland interior, past trunks that had previously been hidden by the dense summer growth. The thinning of the canopy allowed long, angled lances of pale white sunlight to pierce the dark heart of the forest, illuminating the ancient columns of timber and creating an ever-shifting mosaic of light and shadow on the ground. The first whisper of the autumn frost had not brought a sense of death to the forest, but rather a grand, serene unveiling, exposing the timeless skeletal strength of the oaks and dressing the earth in a wealthy gown of bronze and gold. Where the open pastures faded in the grey undergrowth of the woodland border, a monumental limestone boulder stood half submerged in a bed of dry bracken. This was the customary stone, an ancient landmark where the administrative alleys of the manor lord intersected with the traditional survival practice of the peasantry. Waiting beside this marker was Warden Wolfram, the forest overseer, or Waldvogt, who represent the legal authority of the estate. Wolfram was a man of deliberate movements, dressed in a heavy coat of boiled green wool that bore the faint, pleasant scent of cedar oil and cured leather. He did not carry weapons of war, but rather tools of a surveyor and custodian, a long oak measuring rod marked with notches, and a heavy leather pouch containing several smooth-planed beechwood tally sticks, known in the region as kerbholzer. The meeting between old Aldous and the warden was a quiet, ritualistic affair, a demonstration of the sophisticated customary laws that preserve peace and stability in the 10th century Rhine Valley. There was no antagonism here, for both men understood that the preservation of the forest was paramount to the survival of the entire community. They exchanged a low, respectful nod, their breath forming synchronized plumes of white mist in the cold morning air. Wolfram opened his leather pouch and drew out a master tally stick, its surface already marked with horizontal scores representing the seasonal allowances of the manor. This encounter marked the formal commencement of the Acheln, the traditional German term for the autumn corn mass grazing, a right protected not by royal decrees written in Latin scripts, by the unshakable memory of the village elders. The customary law was incredibly precise. It dictated exactly how many swine could enter the oak grooves based on a careful assessment of the year's mast crop. Weeks earlier, Wolfram had walked the interior of the forest, observing the density of the green and brown clusters hanging from the branches, estimating the abundance of the food supply. A forest value in this era was measured not by its acreage or its potential for lumber, but by its capacity to sustain life. A landscape was officially recorded as a forest of 500 swine or a grove of 100 swine. On this day, Wolfram and Aldous were confirming the quota for the manor's herd, assuring that the woodland floor would not be overgrazed, which would damage the natural regeneration of the young oak saplings, nor underutilized, which would waste the precious starchy bounty of the earth. Bruno watched in silent fascination as Wolfram took a small, sharp iron blade from his belt and placed a new, shallow notch across the joined tally sticks held together in his hand. One half of this split stick would remain with Wolfram to be presented at the Lord's annual accounting court, while the matching half would be carried by Aldous into the deep woods as a legal passport, proving to any passing forest ranger that their presence was authorized and balanced. This simple piece of carved beechwood represent a complex economic contract. In exchange for access to the rich acorn canopy, the manor peasants would quiet render a small percentage of the fattened livestock, the tithe of the mast, to the Lord's winter larders. It was a system built on mutual dependence, where human law mirrored the balanced cycles of the natural world. With the notch successfully carved, Wolfram carefully returned the blade to its sheath and smoothed his hand over the split grain of the wood. He turned his gaze toward the long line of swine waiting patiently behind Bruno, their ears twitching at the sound of the wind through the trees. The warden offered a quiet word of blessing for the journey, a traditional phrase wishing them clear paths and abundant mast beneath the shelter of the branches. The legal threshold had been passed. The administrative machinery of the manor had done its work with the same slow, quiet deliberation that guided the growth of the trees themselves. Aldous slipped his half of the tally stick securely into his woolen vest, resting his hand against it as if it were a talisman of protection, and signalled to Bruno that it was time to guide the herd across the boundary line and into the ancient, law-protected piece of the Oak Realm. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales, gently curated and narrated based on themes such as the rise and fall of nations, human cultures, and extraordinary journeys through time. The morning preparations were carried out with a silent, practiced fishes that required no spoken words between old Aldous and young Bruno. In the pale, silver-tinted light of the courtyard, Aldous conducted a final inspection of his gear, ensuring that everything needed for an extended stay beneath the canopy was securely in place. He ran his hand down the length of his ash stave, feeling the smooth, flame-hardened wood that had been polished by years of friction against his palms. This stick was more than a tool for steering the herd. It was an extension of his arm, a balancing for steep forest track, and a means to gently tap the trunks of trees to signal his location to the animals. Hanging from his woven leather belt was a simple utility knife, a small iron flint striker, and a dried gourd container filled with pure grease to protect his boots from the constant moisture of the woodland loam. Beside him, Bruno adjusted the coarse straps of his own small shoulder satchel, which held a modest ration of dense rye bread, a small wedge of hard, salted cheese, and a hand-carved horn spoon. The clothing worn by both herdsmen was designed purely for endurance, thick, undid wool tunics that had been lightly greased, with mutton fat to create a natural water-resistant barrier against the persistent autumn drizzle and heavy morning mists. As they stepped away from the low, timbered walls of the manor cottages, the swine began to gather round them, sensing the familiar rhythm of the journey. The herd was a remarkable collection of semi-willed animals, possessing long, muscular legs, narrow faces, and coats of thick, coarse bristles that varied in colour from deep charcoal grey to a warm, rusty brown. These creatures moved with a surprising, quiet grace, their small hooves clicking softly against the frozen stones of the village path. Aldous raised his stave, letting out a low, resonant hum from the back of his throat, an ancient, wordless call that had been used by the swineherds of the Rhine Valley for generations. It was a sound the animals knew intimately, a signal that promised abundance and safety. Hearing the call, the led sow, an old and wise animal with a notched ear, turned her head toward the great well of trees and began a slow, deliberate march toward the boundary. The rest of the herd followed in an orderly, single-file line, their sensitive snouts already twitching as they caught the rich, earthy scent of the deep woods drifting down on the northern breeze. The distance between the village fences and the forest threshold seemed to shrink with every synchronized step. The open, frosty whirl of the valley gradually giving way to the monumental presence of the ancient timber. As the first annals crossed the line marked by Wolfram's boundary stone, an immediate and profound atmospheric shift occurred. It was as if they had stepped through an invisible portal into an entirely different realm. The sharp, biting wind that had been sweeping across the open meadows was suddenly blocked by the massive, interlocking trunks of the outer oak trees. The temperature dropped slightly, but the air felt more stable, protected by the dense dome of branches overhead that functioned as a great, natural roof. The bright, flat grey light of the morning sky was instant filtered, transforming into complex, shifting mosaic of amber lances, smoky gold shafts, and deep, velvety shadows that clung to the bases of the massive trees. The open horizon vanished, replaced by an intimate, enclosed architecture of ancient bark and twisting limbs. With the very first steps into the interior, the auditory landscape changed completely. The hard, frosty ground of the pasture was replaced by a thick, resilient cushion of fallen oak leaves that had accumulated over the recent weeks. As the 80 pairs of hooves and the leather boots of the two herdsmen pressed in this golden carpet, the forest filled with a deep, rhythmic crunching and crackling, a clean, dry sound that seemed to vibrate softly through the soles of their feet. The animals instantly lowered their heads, their long snouts ploughing gently through the bronze layers, tossing up small clouds of rich, aromatic leaf dust as they sought out the first hidden prizes of the woodland floor. Bruno looked back one last time, seeing the open fields of the manor shimmering like a distant, silver ribbon through the gaps in the trees. Then he turned his face forward, fully immersing him in the quiet, golden sanctuary of the ancient forest. Moving deeper into the interior of the woodland, the vertical scale of the ancient forest asserted itself with a silent, monumental majesty. Looking upward from the carpet of fallen leaves, world of the open sky was replaced by a vast, intricate architecture of living wood. This was the great oak canopy, a multi-layered ceiling composed of thousands of intersecting branches that had spent centuries stretching toward the light, creating a natural vaulting that rivaled the grandest stone basilicas of Christendom. The structural geometry of these ancient European oaks was entirely unique, unlike the straight, predictable columns of the northern pine forests. These ancient trees grew with a wild, deliberate complexity. Their massive limbs emerged from trunks that were 10 feet wide, reaching out horizontally for 40 or 50 feet before curving elegantly upward toward the sun, forming a dense network of timber arches that seemed to support the very weight of the autumn clouds. The lines of these branches were twisted and gnarly, carrying the physic scars of countless winter storms, heavy snowfalls, and the slow, irresistible pressures of time. Where two great limbs had grown too close over the generations, their bark had fused together, creating natural bridges and reinforcing the structural integrity of the collective canopy. Smaller twigs and offshoots proliferated from these primary limbs in an infinite, fractal pattern, filling every cubic inch of the upper airspace with a delicate lace of wood. This dense lattice functioned as an immense, natural filter, catching the steady northern winds and breaking their momentum, turning what would have been a harsh, biting gale in the open valley into a soft, circulating breeze that moved gently through the lower levels of the forest floor. The quality of the light that managed to penetrate this majestic ceiling was extraordinary, transformed by the geometry of the branches and the remaining foliage into physical substance. Because the autumn sun remained low on the southern horizon, its rays did not fall directly down from above, but rather sliced horizontally through the multi-tiered structure of the canopy. This created long, dramatic lances of pale white and golden light that pierced the deep emerald and amber shadows of the interior. These shafts of light, visible in the damp air as columns of illuminated mist and microscopic leaf dust, shifted constantly with the subtle movement of the wind. A single beam would strike the rough bark of a middle branch, illuminating a hidden patch of grey lichen and turning it into shimmering mosaic of silver, fading back in the deep, protective gloom as the upper leaves shifted. The leaves that still clung to the high branches formed a beautiful, mosaic ceiling of varying textures and shape. Though the first frost had drained them of their summer vitality, they remained a wealthy asset to the woodland landscape, held aloft by stems that had hardened over the season. They were arranged in overlapping layers, creating a dense thatch that prevented the heat of the earth from escaping in the upper atmosphere, while simultaneously protecting the ground from the sudden impacts of heavy rain. The sound of the wind passing through this specific geometry was a continuous, low-frequency murmur, a deep, rhythmic sigh that filled the ears of the herdsman with a sense of absolute permanence. It was the sound of a living machine working in perfect equilibrium with the elements, a comforting acoustic backdrop that had remained unchanged for thousands of years. Old Aldous and young Bruno moved beneath this immense ceiling with a slow, respectful tread, their figures appearing small and insignificant against the scale of the ancient timber. Yet, they felt no sense of isolation. The architecture of the oak canopy provided a profound feeling of shelter, enclosing them in a world that felt ancient, stable, and completely secure. Every step forward revealed a new perspective on the overhead woodwork, a different arrangement of arches, a new alignment of light shafts, and a deeper appreciation for the silent, slow-moving forces that had spent centuries constructing this golden temple of the wilderness. The herd moved forward in perfect alignment with this rhythm, their dark bodies dappled by the alternating patches of sun and shadow that danced across the forest floor, fully integrated in the grand, peaceful design of the oak realm. As the herd settled into a slow, rhythmic pattern of foraging, the focus of the journey shifted from the grand horizontal vistas of the woodland to the intimate, micro-world existing just inches above the earth. Old Aldous came to a gentle halt near the buttressed roots of a towering oak whose bark was silvered with rings of slow-growing lichen. With a deliberate, creaking movement that mirrored the ancient trees themselves, the old swineherd sank to one knee, resting his weight against his ash stave. He gestured with a weathered hand for Bruno to join him on the forest floor. Here, away from the wind, the air was remarkably still, laden with the profound, intoxicating scent of rich, damp peat, ancient leaf mould, and the sharp, clean bitterness of wild ferns that had begun to curl inward for the winter. Aldous reached out and cleared away a thick layer of golden, brown leaves, revealing the true treasure of the autumn migration. Nestled in a bed of deep green hair-cap moss lay dozens of plump, glossy acorns, their smooth, polished shells catching the faint lances of filtered sunlight. The old man scooped a handful of these forest jewels into his palm, letting them slide slowly between his calloused fingers with a soft, clicking sound that resembled the counting of heavy stone beads. He picked one up, presenting it to Bruno's curious gaze. and began his first lesson in the subtle science of the forest floor. He pointed to the cap of the acorn, the woody cupule that had held the nut securely to the branch through the summer storms. A perfect acorn, Aldous whispered, must possess a tight, clean pattern on its cap, resembling the fine masonry of a well-built stone wool. The shell of the nut itself was an object of natural beauty, painted in a deep, lustrous mahogany that faded into pale, olive green near its pointed tip. Aldous instructed the boy to feel the weight of the acorn in his small hand. A healthy, starch mast, capable of transforming the lean frame of a winter swine into a magnificent asset for the manor, felt surprisingly heavy for its size, solid and unyielding under pressure. The old man then selected another acorn from the ground, one that appeared identical to the untrained eye, but when he turned it over, he revealed a tiny, perfectly circular hole bored through the smooth shell. This, he explained, was the work the oak weevil, a silent competitor for the forest bounty. A nut thus pierced was hollowed out, bitter and useless to the herd, a sign that nature always takes its portion before humans arrive. The most critical part of the lesson, however, belonged not to the eyes or the touch, but to the ears. Aldous sat completely motionless, encouraging Bruno to listen past the ambient rustling of the canopy to the specific, localized sounds of the woodland floor. Across the vast interior, a steady, regular percussion was taking place, the rhythmic phenomenon known to generations of herdsmen as the acorn drop. Every few moments, a distinct, soft sound echoed through the quiet grooves, a gentle bawp as a heavy, ripe nut detached from a high branch and tumbled through the lower tiers of foliage before striking the soft, mossy earth. The sound varied beautifully depending on where the prize landed. An acorn striking a thick bed of dried leaves produced a crisp, hollow rustle. One landing on exposed limestone rock gave a sharp, metallic clack, while those falling in the deep cushions of velvet moss were greeted by a quiet, muffled thud that was barely audible. Bruno sat in the silence, his senses tuning in this ancient, terrestrial height. He began to understand that a master swineherd did not blindly wander the woods. He followed the music of the falling mast, guiding his animals toward the areas where the acoustic rhythm was thickest and most frequent. The forest was active, dropping its wealth, a continuous, unhurried distribution of sustenance that had sustained the valley's inhabitants for 1,000 years. This lesson, delivered without the aid of written words or complex instruments, established a foundation bond between the young apprentice and the landscape, teaching him that survival in the medieval world required an absolute, patient attunement to the quietest whispers of the natural order. As the sun climbed to its midday peak, casting short, concentrated pools of light around the bases of the giant timbers, the terrain began to slope gently downward into sheltered limestone glen. The herd, moving with a collective intuition that matched the natural topography of the land, followed a faint, ancient path worn deep into the earth by centuries of wildlife. Here, hidden away from the broader paths of the forest interior, lay a sanctuary of secret streams, a network of clear, slow-moving brooks that emerged from mysterious subterranean springs deep in the rocky spine of the Rhine hills. The transition in this low-lying hollow brought a noticeable change in the acoustic and atmospheric qualities of the day. The dry, crisp rustle of the upper canopy receded slight, replaced by the delicate, liquid music of water, trickling over ancient stone, a continuous, gurgling murmur that seemed to wash over the quiet landscape. The brook that wound its way through the scent of the glen was a marvel of pristine clarity, entirely untouched by the agriculture runoff of the lower valleys. The water moved with a slow, unhurried rhythm, filling deep, natural basins formed by smooth shelves of dark slate and grey granite before spilling over miniature barriers of water-worn gravel. Because the stream was fed by deep earth aquifers, its temperature remained remarkably constant, resisting both the summer heat and the early autumn frosts. The surface of the pools was as smooth as polished glass, acting as a perfect mirror for the grand architecture overhead. Looking down in the water, one could see a flawless reflection of the golden oak branches, the pale blue of the midday sky, and the slow, drifting passage of high white clouds, all framed by the rich green borders of the overhanging banks. The edges of the stream were lined with thick, velvety carpets of water, moss and emerald liverwort, which thrived in the perpetual moisture of the hollow. These plants clung to the damp stones like plush cushions, absorbing the cold water and releasing a clean, mineral-rich scent that mingled beautifully with the earthy aroma of the surrounding oak mold. Large, prehistoric-look ferns, their fronds painted in varying shades of olive and deep forest green, drooped gracefully over the water's edge, their tips occasionally dipping in the gentle current to create tiny, circular ripples that expanded outward across the transparent pools. Below the surface, the bed of the stream was composed of thousands of multicolored river pebbles, shades of terracotta red, pale quartz, and deep iron black, all smoothed in perfect ovals by the relentless, gentle friction of the passing water over millennia. Upon reaching this watery oasis, the herd came to a natural, contented halt. The old Lidsow was the first to approach the bank. Her large, leather-like snout lowered toward the crystal surface with an air of profound satisfaction. She dipped her mouth into the cool water, drinking with slow, deep swallows that produced a rhythmic, splashing sound. The rest of the swine followed her example, spreading out along the winding course of the brook, their dark, bristly bodies forming a striking silhouette against the pale stone and shimmering pools. Some of the animals stood knee-deep in the shallowest sections, their hooves clicking softly against the submerged gravel, while others contentedly explored the damp mud of the margins, uncovering succulent roots of water, cresses and wild celery that grew along the sheltered banks. Old Aldous and young Bruno stood quietly on a low wooden footbridge that crossed the narrowest point of the stream, watching the peaceful scene unfold below them. Aldous rested both hands on his ash stave, his face illuminated by the dancing reflections of the sunlit water. He pointed out to Bruno a small school of native river trout, their dark, speckled bodies hovering motionless against the current, nearly invisible against the pebbled bottom except for the occasional silver flash of their turning fins. The old man explained that these secret streams were the lifeblood of the forest grazing. Without these reliable, unpolluted watering holes, the herd could not remain deep within the interior for the weeks required to complete the fattening process. The stream provided not just hydration, but a space of absolute rest and equilibrium, a cool sanctuary where the domestic world of the manor herd synchronized perfectly with the timeless, self-sustaining flow of the primeval wilderness. Leaving the clear, liquid sanctuary of the limestone brook, the move with an unhurried, collective weight back up toward the gently rolling plateau of the forest interior. Here, the density of the ancient oaks reached its peak, and the carpet of fallen mast was at its most abundant. Under the grand, vaulted canopy, a magnificent and peaceful banquet began to unfold, a scene of natural consumption that had remained entirely unchanged since the days of the first ancestral settlers. The 80 swine of the manor spread out across the wide, moss-covered floor, breaking into small, companionable clusters of 3 or 4 animals. There was no sense of frantic haste or aggressive competition among them. The sheer, overwhelming abundance of the acorn drop had established atmosphere, absolute security and tranquility. The forest had provided a table so wide and heavily laden that every creature could find its portion at its own deliberate pace. The primary instrument of this great woodland feast was the remarkable anatomy of the medieval swine's snout. These animals possessed a highly developed, muscular disc of cartilage at the tip of their noses, reinforced by dense, bone and sensitive nerve endings that allowed them to read the rich, subterranean landscape with incredible precision. Bruno watched as a large, bristled sow lowered her head, her long snout ploughing gently beneath the golden brown layers of dry leaves. She moved with a rhythmic, sweeping motion, tossing aside the crisp foliage to reveal the dark, damp earth beneath. Her sense of smell, incredibly sharp and attuned to the chemistry of the forest, allowed her to instantly bypass the bitter, withered nuts or those hollowed out by wood insects, locking onto the heaviest, buried deep within the damp moss. Once a perfect prize was located, the auditory landscape of the forest grove transformed in a beautiful, localized symphony of consumption. The quiet afternoon filled with a distinct, tenuous crackling and crunching, a crisp, rhythmic chorus that echoed softly off the rough bark of the giant tree trunks. It was the sound of powerful jaws fracturing the hard, polished mahogany shells of the acorn. A single animal would scoop up a nut, hold it between its heavy molars, and apply a steady pressure until the outer casing split open with a sharp, clean snap. This was followed by the soft, wet sound of steady mastication as the swine ground down the dense, starky kernel within. The animals ate with a profound, single-minded focus, their small, pointed ears twitching in contentment, and their short tails wagging in slow, lazy arcs as they moved from one rich pock of moss to the next. This mass exsumption of the mast released a highly specific and complex aroma that hung heavily in the still, windless air of the hollows, as thousands of acorn shells were broken open simultaneously. The forest floor became saturated with a deep, bittersweet perfume, a mixture of raw vegetable starch, wild tannin, and the rich, oily essence of the nut meat, combined with the underlying scent of crushed ferns and damp peat. To old Aldous, this specific fragrance was the very smell of economic security. He knew that the unique chemical composition of the oak mast, wealthy in complex carbohydrate and specialized vegetable fats, possessed a near miraculous ability to transform the livestock. The lean, muscular frame of the forest-ranging swine would rapidly absorb these nutrients, building a thick, firm layer of pale, pristine fat that was highly prized across the Carolingian world for its durability and rich flavor. As the hours of the afternoon drifted quietly away, the harmony between the foraging herd and the ancient forest became absolute. The pigs act as natural cultivators of the woodland floor by ploughing up the compressed layers of leaves and turning the topsoil with their snouts. They were exposing the hidden seeds of wild grasses and aerating the earth around the massive root systems of the oaks. They were not destroying the landscape, but participating directly in its health and regeneration. Bruno leaned his back against a low-growing hazel bush, his eyes tracking the slow, repetitive movements of the animals. In this quiet corner of the world, far removed from the complex demands of the manor courts or the anxieties of the approaching winter frost, life had narrowed down to a simple, beautiful equilibrium, the trees dropping their wealth from the sky, and the earth's creatures receiving it with a slow, dignified gratitude that filled the great woods with peace. As the late autumn sun completed its slow arc across the southern sky, the character of the light within the oak forest began to shift dramatically, introducing a period of deep, visual poetry. The brilliant, fiery golds and bright ambers of the midday hours gradually softened, melting into rich, heavy tones of liquid copper and deep magenta. This was the arrival of the evening twilight, a transition hour when the forest seemed to draw a long, quiet breath and settle into a state of profound stillness. The long, angled shafts of sunlight that had pierced the canopy all afternoon grew wider and more diffused, turning into soft, smoky columns of lavender and pale violet that hung suspended in the cooling air. The space between the massive oak trunks, previous sharp and defined, began to fill with a gentle, velvety gloom that blurred the sharp outlines of the landscape and brought a sense of immense, protective enclosure to the entire glen. Old Aldous stood perfect still on a small rise, his silhouette framed against the fading luminescence of the western sky. He adjusted the heavy folds of his woolen cloak, drawing the fabric closer around his chest to repel the creeping chill of the dusk. Beside him, Bruno watched the very last beam of direct sunlight strike the upper trunk of a monumental white oak. The light seemed to linger there for a few precious moments, igniting the rough, split bark into brilliant, glowing ribbon of orange fire before slow gliding upward, detaching from the tree's highest twig, and vanishing entirely into the upper atmosphere. With the departure of that final ray, the colours of the forest floor underwent a subtle transformation. The bright bronze of the fallen leaves deepened into a rich, dark mahogany, while the emerald green of the haircap moss transitioned into a mysterious, cool shade of slate blue. The auditory environment changed in perfect synchronization with the fading light. The sharp, enthusiastic crunching of acorn shells that had filled the forest all afternoon began to slow down, losing its energetic rhythm. The swine, fully satisfied by hours of uninterrupted feasting upon the rich starch of the mast, were moving with an even greater, heavy deliberation. Their long, low grunts, which had been frequent and communicative during the height of the day, softened into a series of quiet, rhythmic sighs that drifted through the twilight like a gentle murmur of contentment. One by one, following the silent example of the old lead sow, the animals began to look for comfortable resting places for the night, gathering in small, companionable groups near the shelter of the massive, buttressed root systems of the giant tree. They cleared away the top layer of damp leaves with their snouts, exposing the dry, insulating earth beneath, and lay down together, their dark bodies blending seamlessly in the lengthening shadows of the forest floor. The wind that had swept through the high branches during the day died down completely, leaving the air within the interior hollows absolutely motionless and pristine. In this vacuum of silence, the smallest natural sounds gained a beautiful, resonant clarity. A single, dry leaf, detaching from a branch 50 feet above, could be heard tracing its entire, spiraling path downward, brushing against other leaves with a faint, paper-like hiss before landing softly on the ground. Far away, near the banks of the secret limestone stream, a lone wood owl let out its first tentacle of the night, a deep, hollow cadence that vibrated softly through the columns of timber, emphasizing the immense scale and peace of the wilderness. The forest was closing its day with a dignified, unhurried grace, wrapping its inhabitants in a vast blanket of shadow and silence that promised safety and rest until the return of the morning sun. If you have found comfort in this peaceful journey through the ancient woods of the past, please take a quiet moment too. Subscribe to the channel, leave a gentle like, and share this story with others who seek a tranquil retreat into history. The deep quiet of the woodland interior, having settled comfortable over the slumbering herd, was gently visited by the sound of approaching footsteps, deliberate, slow, and thoroughly familiar to the creatures of the woods. Out from the soft, lavender mists of the adjacent beech grove emerged Warden Wolfram, the forest's overseer, forming his evening rounds with the quiet constancy of a man whose life was entirely bound to the preservation of the grand timber. His heavy green wool coat, dark with the moisture of the low-hanging clouds, blended seamlessly with the moss-covered trunks, making him appear like a natural extension of the forest itself. In his right hand, he carried his notched oak measuring rod, its base tapping the earth with a low, rhythmic thud that signalled his presence to old Aldous without breaking the profound stillness of the twilight. Wolfram's purpose on this evening was one of vital ecological stewardship, a demonstration of the sophisticated conservation practices that guided the medieval manor's relationship with the wilderness. He stopped at the edge of the glen where the swine had spent the afternoon foraging, his calm eyes scanning the newly turned earth. To an untrained eye, the disrupted leaves might have looked like chaotic disorder, but to the warden, it was a readal manuscript of forest health. He approached a monumental oak whose roots spread out like massive wooden fingers across the loam. Dropping to one knee with a slow, measured movement, Wolfram extended his hand to inspect the lower bark of the trunk and the delicate junction where the roots met the soil. The customary laws of the 10th century were remarkably clear regarding the protection of the living trees during the Pannage season. While the swine were entitled to every fallen acorn on the ground, they were strictly forbidden from causing permanent damage to the structural integrity of the oaks. Wolfram carefully examined the rough, deeply furrowed bark of the root collars, ensuring that the animals, in their enthusiasm for the sweet starch of the mast, had not used their sharp tusks or heavy snouts to strip the protective casing from the base of the timber. A stripped tree would be vulnerable to the creeping rot of the winter dampness, a tragedy that would weaken the canopy for future generations. Finding the bark clean, unmarred, and perfectly intact, the warden ran his fingers over the exposed wood with a gesture of profound respect, satisfied that Aldous was managing the herd with traditional care. He then used the tip of his measuring rod to gently probe the depth of the turned soil. The swine natural ploughing action had aerated the top layer of rich, dark humus, breaking up the dense compaction caused by the summer rains without disturbing the deeper, delicate root systems. This gentle cultivation actually aided the forest ecosystem, allowing the late autumn moisture to penetrate deep into the subterranean earth and exposing old, buried seeds to the air, where they would lie dormant until the spring awakening. Wolfram nodded quietly, his face illuminated by the soft, ambient light of the rising moon. The equilibrium between human utility and natural preservation was being maintained perfectly, a testament to the ancient wisdom that viewed the forest not as a resource to be exhausted, but as a living partner to be cherished. Rising slowly to his feet, Wolfram walked toward the small knoll where Aldous and Bruno had established their quiet vantage point. No loud greetings were exchanged. Instead, the men shared a low, muttered word of mutual understanding, their voice catching the slow, rolling rhythm of the forest breeze. The warden shared his observations, noting that this specific sector of the oak woods possessed an exceptionally deep layer of healthy leaf mold, capable of absorbing the herd's presence for several more days before they would need to transition to the higher ridges. He adjusted the leather pouch containing his beechwood tally stick, knowing that the records they kept were a true reflection of a balanced world. As Wolfram turned to continue his silent vigil into the deeper, uncharted sectors of the Grand Forest, his figure was slowly swallowed by the creeping purple shadows, leaving behind a profound sense of security and validation for the herdsmen, who knew that their ancient journey was guarded by the watchful, loving eyes of the manor law. As the night deepened over the 10th century landscape, a profound atmospheric phenomenon began to develop along the low-lying basin of the Rhine River. During the height of the autumn days, the massive volume of the river water had absorbed the gentle warmth of the filtered sun, retaining a reservoir of thermal energy even as the upper air grew cold. Now, under the clear, star-lit sky of the late evening, the sharp northern wind died away completely, allowing the freezing night air to drop silently in the valley floor, where this icy atmospheric layer met the warm, rising breath of the great river. A thick, white vapor began to bloom. It originated among the dense beds of river reeds and willow thickets along the water's edge, rising slowly like the smoke of a silent, subterranean hearth, before gathering into massive, protective shroud of dense river fog. This heavy, luminous mist did not remain confined to the riverbank. With a slow, resistible momentum, it began to creep outward across the flat, open geography of the manor land. It glided effortlessly over the dry stubble of the harvested rye fields, filling the drainage ditches, swallowing the wooden boundary fences, and erasing the sharp contours of the timber longhouses. To an observer on the high ridges, the village below seemed to dissolve quietly into a vast sea of milky white cotton, its thatched roofs appearing like small, dark island floating on a silent, ethereal ocean. The fog carried with it a profound silence, acting as a massive acoustic dampener that absorbed the residual sounds of the human settlement, locking domestic world away in a state of absolute, insulated stillness. Having conquered the lowlands, the great white shroud moved toward the rising slope of the ancient oak forest. It met the outer line of boundary stones and began to weave its way between the massive, buttressed trunks of the centuries-old trees. The transition of the fog in the woodland interior was a visual masterpiece of nature, because the interlocking canopy overhead blocked the open sky. The mist did not from above. Instead, it flowed horizontally through the natural corers of the timber columns, moving like a slow-flowing river of pure white light. It advanced in long, elegant tendrils that wrapped around the rough, furrowed bark of the oaks, filling the hollows between the roots and settling heavily over the thick carpets of bronze leaves and green moss. Within minutes, the interior of the glen was completely transformed. The grand, vertical architecture of the canopy vanished into a soft, uniform grey ceiling, and the distant rows of oak trunks faded in ghostly silhouettes before disappearing entirely in the white gloom. The visual world contracted beautifully, narrowing down to an intimate, sacred space extending only a few yards around old Aldous and young Bruno. Rather than bring a sense of isolation or confinement, this environmental boundary created a profound feeling of safety and insulation. The heavy mist functioned as an immense, natural blanket, trapping the earth's residual warmth beneath the trees and preventing the severe, brack frost of the upper atmosphere from freezing the forest floor. The physical sensations within the fog were remarkably distinct and clean. Bruno raised his hand, observing how the musk-cocked droplets of water suspended in the air caught the pale light of the hidden moon, creating a soft, ambient luminescence that seemed to glow from within the mist itself. The air he inhaled was pristine, cold, and heavily saturated with moisture, carrying a deep, refreshing taste that washed away the dust of the day's travel. Tiny, silver beads of condensation began to crystallize along the coarse fibers of their wool cloaks and the smooth surface of Alder's ash stave, turning their clothing into a glittering armor of dew. Beneath this protective white shroud, the manor herd lay completely enveloped in peace. The swine were nestled together in the deep hollows of the oak roots, their dark, bristly bodies huddled in close, warm clusters that generated a collective pool of heat. The fog drifted lazily over their sleeping form, catching the rhythmic, heavy rise and fall of their breath and blend it seamlessly in the wider atmospheric currents of the night. The animals were entirely hidden from the outside world, shielded by a wall of pure water and air that guaranteed their absolute security. In this quiet, insulated pocket of the Rhine Valley, the ancient forest and the great river had joined forces to create a sanctuary of total rest, wrapping the herdsmen and their charges in a soft, timeless embrace that barred the entry of winter's harshness. Within the soft, silver glowing perimeter of the river mist, old Aldous determined that the moment had arrived to establish their temporary habitation for the night, deep in the interior of the 10th century forest. A herdsman did not look for stone walls or permanent timber structures. Instead, they relied on a traditional form of ephemeral architecture known across the Germanic lands as a Lobhut, or a leaf hut. This humble dwelling, constructed entirely from the pliable materials found within a few yards of their chosen knoll, was designed to provide absolute barrier against the damp night air, functioning as a warm, insulative cocoon that harmonized perfectly with the surrounding terrain. Aldous stepped toward a small cluster of young hazel trees that grew in the understory of the giant oaks, his fingers selecting branches that possessed the ideal balance of length, strength, and structural flexibility. With slow, practiced strokes of his small iron utility knife, the old man cut several long, straight hazel rods, the blade shaving through the smooth, pale grey bark with a clean, satisfying hiss. He passed these switches to Bruno, instructing the boy to feel the vital elasticity of the green wood. Together, they carried the timbers back to a small depression between the massive, buttressed roots of a centuries-old white oak. This natural hollow would serve as the foundation of their shelter, utilizing the monumental trunk of the great tree as a solid, unyielding rear wall that would store the residual warmth of the earth. Aldous began the construction by driving the thicker ends of the hazel rods deep in the soft, dark loam, spacing them evenly in a semicircular pattern that traced the curve of the root system. Once the primary stakes were firmly anchored in the subterranean soil, Aldous showed Bruno how to bend the flexible tips of the rods toward the center, intertwining them with one another to form a series of low, elegant Gothic arches. The wood resisted gently, its fibers tensioning under pressure, but the old man's hands were patient and firm, locking the tips together using thin, stripped ribbons of willow bark that he drew from his satchel. This created the skeletal framework of the shelter, a sturdy, ribbed dome that stood no higher than a man's shoulder, remarkably resilient against the weight of the heavy fog. Bruno marveled at how quickly the simple collection of switches transformed into distinct, defined architectural space, an intimate sanctuary of lines and lattices carved out of the wider wilderness. With the framework secured, the task shifted to the creation of the protective outer thatch. Bruno was sent to gather large armfuls of green spruce boughs and dried bracken ferns from a nearby clearing. his movements deliberate and quiet so as not to disturb the resting herd. He returned with bundles of dark pine needles that carried a sharp, resinous perfume, a clean scent that cut through the heavy, stagnant dampness of the river mist. Aldous took these boughs and began layering them over the hazel ribs, starting from the base of the mound and working upward in overlapping rows, precisely mimicking the pattern of the rye thatch on the village longhouses. This green layer functioned as a natural water shedding membrane, designed to channel the condensing moisture of the fog away from the interior space. The final and most critical component of the Lauhut was the addition of the leaf insulation. Using their wooden staves, Aldous and Bruno scraped thousands of fallen oak leaves into a massive mound against the sides of the structure. They packed the bronze and gold foliage tightly against the spruce boughs, creating a dense, multi-layered blanket nearly a foot thick. These dry, paper-like leaves held millions of tiny pockets of air in their curled shapes, forming an incredibly efficient thermal barrier that would trap their body heat inside while barring the entry of the creeping frost. The sound of this packing process was a soft, continuous rustling, a dry, rhythmic whisper that seemed to echo the natural patterns of the autumn wind through the canopy. Inside the tiny dome, the world contracted down to a space of absolute intimacy and warmth. Bruno crept through the low opening, discovering a floor that had been lined with a thick, aromatic mattress of dried mosses and soft fern. The air within the shelter was completely still, completely dry, and heavily scented with the comforting mixture of pine resin, sweet hazel bark, and the deep, clean aroma of the forest floor. Sitting cross-legged in the darkness, the young apprentice could hear the heavy, slow-moving river fog brushing softly against the outer leaf walls, but not a single drop of moisture or breath of cold air could pierce the barrier. They had successfully built an island of safety within the ancient forest, a manifestation of human ingenuity that provided comfort, rest, and complete security for the long night ahead. At the threshold of their small leaf shelter, where the thick wool of the river mist met the enclosed microclimate of the oak roots, old Aldous prepared to invite a small, controlled pocket of warmth into the deepening night. Working with the slow, rhythmic deliberation that defined his every movement, he reached deep into his oiled leather pouch to retrieve the tools of fire-making objects unchanged by the passage of centuries. He produced a crescent-shaped of hand-forged iron, the fire, steel, and a sharp fragment of grey flint gathered from the gravel riverbeds of the Rhine. Nestled precisely between his thumb and the flint was a small, delicate patch of true tinder fungus, harvested from the bark of fallen birch tree and dried over a summer hearth until it was as light and porous as spun wool. With a practised, sliding strike of the steel against the sharp edge of the stone, a brilliant cascade of pale yellow sparks spilled in the darkness, catching instantly when the fibrous weave of the tinder. A tiny, orange eye of heat began to glow in the gloom, spreading its radiant warmth through the dark material with a slow, creepy momentum. Aldous carefully transferred the glowing tinder to a waiting nest of dry, shredded cedar bark and fine hazel twigs that he had sheltered beneath his heavy wool cloak. He nurtured the fragile spark, his steady hand shielding the heat from the damp draughts of the forest floor until a thin, fragrant line of white smoke began to curl upward in the overhanging branches. With a soft, crackling sigh, a small flame erupted from the center of the nest, its bright amber light illuminating the weathered contours of the old man's face and casting long, fluid shadows across the monumental root system of the great white oak behind them. One by one, he added thicker pieces of seasoned oak bark and dry heartwood, creating a fire than a man's hand, modest, sustainable hearth designed not to blaze brightly into the night, but to provide a steady, comforting bed of glowing coals that would radiate heat directly into their leaf hut without creating an unnecessary beacon in the dark wilderness. The aroma of the burning oak was rich, clean, and deeply grounded, forming a sharp, comforting contrast to the damp, mineral heather scent of the surrounding river fog. As the small flames settled into rhythmic, pulsing glow, Aldous settled back against his wooden stave, his eyes fixed on the shifting geometry of the amber embers. Beside him, Bruno sat completely spellbound by the dance of light and shadow, his young mind absorbing the sudden, profound intimacy of the forest night. The old swineherd began to speak, his voice dropping into a low, resonant drone that seemed to possess the same timeless texture as the ancient bark around them, perfectly synchronized with the gentle sighing of the upper canopy. He began to tell the boy of the deep lore that bound their ancestors to the majestic oak trees, histories that had never been committed to ink or parchment, but lived purely within the spoken memories of the woodland folk. The oak, Aldous murmured, was not merely a source of durable timber or a provider of seasonal mast. It was the grandeur of the living world, a sacred pillar that stood at the very center of the earth's architecture, its grand crown touching the heavens while its deep roots traveled down in the mysterious, subterranean waters of the underworld. In the ancient days, long before the great stone cathedrals of the big towns had been conceived, the old people looked upon the grand oak groves as living sanctuaries, places where the boundaries between the human world and the timeless forces of nature grew thin and transparent. The oak was revered for its unmatched resilience and iron strength, while the slender willows bent and broke under the fury of the winter gales, and the tall pines split when struck by the summer lightning. The majestic oak stood firm, absorbing the elemental forces of the sky and turning that raw energy into dense, unyielding heartwood. It was a tree that lived on a grander scale of time, measuring its existence not by passing years, but by entire generations of men. An oak would spend 300 years growing to its full stature, 300 years standing in the magnificent fullness of its maturity, and 300 years slowly, gracefully returning its life back to the soil that had nourished it. The very tree in which they slept had likely witnessed the passage of legendary kings, its silent, hidden rings recording the long, unhurried history of the valley with absolute impartiality. Bruno listened with a sense of profound reverence, his gaze drifting from the glowing embers up toward the high, shrouded ceiling of the canopy, where the pale moonlight filtered through the mist to touch the branches like fine silver thread. He realized that the feast his herd had enjoyed during the day was part of a grand, reciprocal compact between the earth and its inhabitants, a cycle of seasonal generosity that repeated itself every autumn without fail. The old man's words brought a deep, unshakable sense of peace and security to the small shelter, anchoring their temporary existence to the eternal permanence of the ancient woods. The small fire crackled softly, a single pock of light and warmth surrounded by a vast sea of dark, silent timber and protective river fog. Outside their tiny sanctuary, the manor herd slept soundly in the hollows of the earth, completely safe under the vigilant gaze of the grand trees, while inside, the ancient lore of the oak wrapped the young apprentice in a blanket of timeless history, guiding his thoughts into a state of quiet, untroubled rest as the long night moved toward the dawn. The arrival of the dawn brought a slow, graceful dispersal of the heavy Rhine mist, revealing the intricate, miniature world that thrived beneath the grand architectural sweep of the oak canopy. As the pale, Silver, tinted light of the morning filtered down through the thinning branches. Young Bruno stepped out of the warm shelter of the leaf hut, his boots pressing silently in the damp, soft earth. The forest floor was not a static carp of decay, but a living, breathing macro-ecosystem, operating on its own, hidden rhythms and populated by countless small creatures that shared this woodland sanctuary with the manor herd. Everywhere the eye travelled, the subtle chemistry of late autumn was visible, showcase a miraculous complexity that usually went unnoticed by the busy inhabitants of the agricultural valleys. At the monumental base of the centuries old oak, where the thick bark formed deep, protected crevices near the soil, a beautiful kingdom of wild fungi had emerged overnight, stimulated by the rich moisture of the river fog. Bruno knelt down to observe a cluster of tiny, translucent mushrooms that grew like delicate porcelain cups along the side of a decaying, moss-covered log. These were the fairy ring mushrooms and velvetfoot fungi, their caps painted in exquisite shades of pale amber, smoky cream, and deep chestnut brown. Some of them possessed a soft, satin-like texture that caught the early morning light, while others held tiny, perfect droplets of dew suspended on their gills like miniature strings of pearls. The aroma rising from these fung colonies was deep, complex, and distinctively earthy, a rich scent of wood, musk, and damp peat that signaled the continuous, quiet breakdown of organic matter, returning the nutrients of the old trees back into the fertile womb of the forest floor. A few paces away, the silence of the grove was visited by a sudden, light rustling when the branches of a low-growing hazel bush. Bruno remained perfect still, watching as a small, red forest squirrel descended the rough trunk of an adjacent oak with an astonishing, fluid agility. This tiny creature, its fur a warm, rusty copper that matched the color of the fallen leaves, moved with an unhurried, focused precision. It dropped to the ground, its sensed whiskers twitching as it scanned the leaf litter for a perfect, unblemished acorn. Finding one, the squirrel gripped the heavy nut between its sharp front teeth, turned it over with its agile paws, and then vanished back up into the high architecture of the canopy, searching for a secret, subterranean hollow where it could store its treasure for the long winter months. Beside it, small wood mice darted like grey shadows between the root, their movements so silent and swift that they appeared like fleeting trickles of water passing through the bronze foliage. The relationship between these wild inhabitants and the domestic swine of the manor was a masterpiece of natural harmony and mutual tolerance. There was no hostility or competition with this woodland banquet. The sheer abundance of the acorn drop had created a peaceful equilibrium that allowed all creatures to thrive simultaneously. As the heavy pigs began to stir from their resting places, their large snouts ploughing gently through the layers of leaves, they were immediately followed by a small flock of wild forest birds, bright-eyed European robins and industrious jays. These birds hopped fearlessly just inches away from the moving snouts of the swine, their sharp eyes scanning the freshly turned loam for small beetles, grubs, and woodlice that had been exposed by the animal's natural cultivation. The pigs paid them no mind, moving with a heavy, benevolent indifference that allowed the birds to feast upon the insects while they themselves focused entirely on the rich starch of the oak mast. This intricate web of life, existing quietly at the level of the moss and the bark, filled young Bruno with a profound sense of peace and connection. He realized that the forest was a completely self-sustaining world, where every organism, from the largest 1,000-year-old oak to the smallest translucent mushroom and busy wood mouse, performed a vital, interconnected role in the grand design of nature. The morning air grew cleaner and crisper as the sun climbed higher, warming the damp earth and causing the last remnants of the river mist to spiral lazily upward in the blue sky. The symphony of the microecosystem, the dripping of the dew, the soft rustle of the foraging squirrels, and the companionable grunts of the well-fed herd created a soothing, rhythmic background that anchored their steps to the eternal, unhurried pulse of the primeval wilderness. The silver-blue sky that had opened briefly after the dispersal of the morning mist began to soften once more, changing into uniform, pearl-grey blanket of low, hanging clouds that drifted slow down the long spine of the Rhine Valley. The air grew perfectly still, losing the sharp, biting edge of the northern breeze and taking on a heavy, cushion quality that carried the clear promise of precipitation. It was not the arrival of a violent autumn tempest or a sweeping winter gale, but rather a gentle, steady seasonal rain, the kind of precipitation that the medieval farmers welcomed, for it soaked deep into the earth without washing away the topsoil or disturbing the dormant seeds of the fields. Deep within the interior of the ancient oak forest, the initial sign of the approaching rain was not felt on the skin, but heard as a distant, whispering murmur high above, where the topmost crowns of the giant trees met the sky. The vast, multi-layered architecture of the oak canopy functioned as a magnificent, living umbrella, presenting an immense berry of branches, twigs, and remaining bronze leaves to the incoming drops. When the first tentative droplets began to fall, they were caught entirely by the upper tiers of the forest ceiling, nearly 80 feet above the ground. This created a beautiful, localized acoustic phenomenon, a soft, rhythmic pattering that sounded like thousands of tiny, silken feet dancing across a vast wooden floor. A single raindrop would strike the tough, leathery surface of a high oak leaf, split into microscopic beads, and glide down the veins before dripping onto middle-tier branch of hazel or birch. This multi-layered design transformed sudden impact of the rain into a slow, cascading descent, turning what would have been a cold, drenching downpour in the open meadows into a gentle, measured filtration of moisture. As the rain settled into steady, unbroken rhythm, the auditory landscape of the forest glen filled with a deep, mesmerizing symphony of natural sound. The percussion varied beautifully depending on the exact material each drop encountered. Rain striking the thick beds of dry, curled oak leaves on the ground produced a crisp, hollow drumming, a clean, resonant sound that amplified the vastness of the woodland interior. Drops that fell into the deep, velvety cushions of hair-capped moss were greeted by a quiet, muffled hiss, as the absorbent green plants drank in the fresh hydration like microscopic sponges. Along the margins of the secret limestone stream, the rain kissed the still surface of the transparent pools with a delicate, clicking melody, creating thousands of tiny, interlocking silver rings that expanded and dissolved in perfect synchronization. This steady application of moisture released a powerful, intoxicating wave of fragrance from the subterranean depths of the forest floor. As the water soaked in the dry top layers, it awakened the deep, dormant chemistry of the earth, saturating the still air with the rich aroma of damp peat, ancient leaf mold, and the clean, medicinal perfume of wet pine needles and crushed bark. The rough, deep-furrowed trunks of the centuries-old oaks began to darken, their silver-grey bark absorbing the water and transforming a deep charcoal black, highlighting the intricate, twisting patterns of their ancient growth. The rain seemed to cleanse the wilderness, washing away the dust of the late summer and wrapping the entire landscape in a pristine, reflective coat of moisture that glistened softly in the ambient, grey light. Inside this rain-soaked sanctuary, the manor herd remained completely untroubled and at peace, protected by the dense dome of the canopy and the natural shelter of the monumental root systems. The swine continued their unhurried foraging with a calm, single-minded focus. Their thick, bristly coats were naturally coated in protective oils, allowing the gentle drips that managed to pierce the canopy to slide effortlessly off their backs without chilling their skin. Some of the animals chose this moment to rest, huddling contentedly inside the dry hollows of the trunk bases, their long ears twitching rhythmically at the sound of the falling water. Old Aldous and young Bruno sat quietly within the dry, insulated womb of their leaf hut, watching the silver curtains of rain drift lazily between the dark columns of timber. The world had narrowed down to this simple rhythm of water and wood, an eternal cycle of renewal that brought comfort, shelter, and absolute security to the heart of the ancient forest. The steady autumn rain eventually tapered off into fine, suspended mist that hung like delicate silver gauze between the dark, monumental columns of the oak forest. As the afternoon light began its slow, inevitable retreat toward the western horizon, old Aldous and young Bruno guided the herd along a sweeping ridge that defined the outer boundaries of their manor's customary grazing territory. This sector of the woodland was marked not by wooden fences or iron gates, but by a natural frontier, a long, meandering line of ancient, hornbeam trees whose trunks had been deliberately bent and interwoven by ancestral hands generations ago to create a living, impenetrable hedge. Beyond this green wall lay the forest lands assigned to a neighboring monastic estate, a vast domain whose spiritual and economic rhythms mirrored their own. As they walked, the silence of the damp grove was gently visited by a familiar, resonant sound drifting through the tinned branches from the far side of the ridge. It was the low, rhythmic crunching of acorn shells and the companionable, guttural murmurs of another herd of foraging swine. The manor animals paused momentarily, their long ears twitching and their sensitive snouts lifting to test the air currents, catching the distinct scent of unfamiliar livestock mixed with the aroma of damp wool and sweet wood smoke. Aldous raised his ash stave, letting out his characteristic, low-frequency hum to reassure his charges. There was no agitation or defensive posturing among the animals. The absolute abundance of the year's massed crop had eliminated the primal urge for territory, wrapping both herds in a shared atmosphere of complete security and peace. Through the soft grey veil of the clearing, two figures emerged from the shadow of a monumental beech tree on the opposite side of the boundary marker. Was an elder swineherd from the monastery lands, accompanied by his own young apprentice. The two old men, who had navigated these same uncharted timber corridors for decades, stopped a few paces from one another, their long wooden staves resting heavily against the damp mossy earth. No loud words of greeting were exchanged, nor did they break the profound stillness of the woodland with unnecessary conversation. In the 10th century wilderness, where long stretches of isolation were the norm, human companionship was treated with a quiet, dignified reverence that required no elaborate ceremonies. They simply exchanged a slow, deliberate nod of recognition, a silent communication that carried a lifetime of mutual respect, shared hardship, and deep understanding of the forest's secrets. The two herdsmen moved toward a flat, lichen-covered limestone boulder that sat precisely upon the boundary line, serving as a traditional meeting place for weary travellers. With slow, unhurried movements, they unbuckled their weathered leather satchels to share their simple midday provisions. The monastic herdsman drew out a dense, dark loaf of barley bread that had been baked in the great stone ovens of the abbey, its thick, ash-dusted crust bearing the faint perfume of field caraway seeds. Aldous, in turn, produced a wedge of hard, well-aged goat's cheese wrapped in oil-soaked linen, prepared by Mistress Drusilla before their departure. Using his small utility knife, Aldous carefully divided the cheese, while the other man broke the heavy loaf of bread by hand, the rough grain snapping with a clean, satisfying sound that echoed softly through the quiet grove. They exchanged these humble gifts across the stone marker, their calloused hands touching briefly in a gesture of silent camaraderie. Sitting side by side on the cold limestone, the four travellers enjoyed their meal in absolute harmony, the rhythmic chewing of the dense bread blending seamlessly with the distant, soothing chorus of their respective herds foraging under the golden canopy. The simple act of breaking bread together transformed the wilderness boundary into a space of sacred sanctuary, a reminder that despite serving different earthly lords, the common folk of the valleys were bound together by the same elemental laws of survival and neighbourly cooperation. As the last crumbs were swept away and the satchels were quietly refastened, the neighbouring herdsman rose, offering a silent gesture of blessing with his hand. They parted as quietly as they had met, their figures slow dissolving back in the grey mists of their respective sectors, leaving old Aldous and Bruno alone once more under the protective, eternal dome of the ancient oak. The silver mists of the early morning gradually lifted from the valley of the Rhine, leaving behind a world that seemed pristine, washed clean by the gentle rains of the previous night. Deep within the interior of the Manor's oak lands, old Aldous stood at the edge of the glen where the herd had spent the last several days. He leaned heavily upon his ash-stave, his sharp but serene eye scanning the expansive floor of the grove. Beside him, young Bruno observed the landscape, noting how the thick carpet of golden brown leaves had been thoroughly turned and aerated by the tireless snouts of the swine. To the young apprentice, it seemed like a space of complete fulfillment, but the old master saw the subtle, silent markers that indicated a change of location was required. Aldous reached down, scooping up a handful of the damp earth, letting the dark, crumbly soil slip slowly through his fingers back onto a bed of crushed moss. He turned to Bruno, his voice a low, rhythmic murmur that blended perfectly with the gentle sighing of the upper canopy. He began to explain the foundational principles of woodland conservation, a sophisticated system of traditional ecology that guided the medieval manor. A true swineherd, Aldous explained, must never look a forest as inexhaustible treasury, but rather as a delicate garden that requires absolute respect and careful rotation. If the herd were to remain in this single grove until every last acorn was consumed, they would commit a grave sin against the earth. They would begin to damage the delicate root systems of the ancient oaks, compact the soil so tightly that the spring rains could no longer penetrate the subterranean layers, and consume the tiny, emerging saplings that represented the future of the great canopy. The customary laws of the 10th century were built upon this profound understanding of balance. The forest was divided into invisible, traditional sectors, and it was the duty of the herdsman to move the livestock continuously from one ridge to the next, following a slow, cyclical pattern that allowed each grove time to rest and regenerate. By leaving a portion of the fallen mass behind, they ensured that the wild woodland creatures, the squirrels, the deer, and the foraging birds had their rightful share of the winter store, and that enough healthy acorns remained to sink deep in the loam, sprouting into new generations of timber centuries later. Human survival in the medieval world was not achieved by exhausting nature, but by synchronizing human needs with the natural capacity of the landscape to heal itself. Aldous raised his ash-stave, tapping the rough bark of a nearby birch tree to signal the old lead's sow. Understanding the command, the wise animal lifted her head from the moss, let out a low, communicative grunt, and began a slow, deliberate march up the sloping side of the ridge. The rest of the herd followed her in an orderly, unhurried line, their hooves creating a steady, rhythmic crunching as they crossed the invisible boundary into a fresh, untouched sector of the forest. This new grove opened before them with a magnificent, untouched abundance. Here, the ground was completely covered in an undisturbed tapestry of deep bronze leaves, hiding millions of plump, mahogany-coloured acorns that had dropped during the recent rain. The air in this high ridge was sharper, cleaner, and filled with the rich, bittersweet aroma of fresh moss. As the swine spread out quietly across the new territory, resuming their peaceful foraging at a patient pace, Bruno felt a deep sense of security wash over him. He realized that the ancient wisdom passed down by old Aldous was a shield that protected both the village and the wild woods, ensuring that the bounty of the earth would return year after year, generation after generation. The world moved by these slow, enduring laws, a beautiful circle of care and longevity that wrapped the entire landscape in absolute peace. If these quiet chronicles of the ancient past have brought a sense of calm and comfort to your evening, please take a soft moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a gentle like, and share these peaceful historical journeys with others who seek a tranquil escape in the rhythms of the earth. November had now fully claimed the high ridges of the Rhine Valley, bringing with it a profound stillness that transformed the ancient oak forest into vast, sensory vault. As the ambient temperature continued its slow, steady descent toward the freezing mark, the air lost its summer agility, becoming dense, heavy, and remarkably stable. In the absence of strong, disrupt winds, this heavy atmosphere functioned as a natural container, trapping the volatilely aromatic compounds of the woodland floor and creating a rich, multi-layered olfactory landscape that was completely unique to the late autumn season. For young Bruno, walking through the quiet grooves was no longer just an exercise in sight and sound. It had become an immersive journey through an invisible library of sense, where every step forward revealed a new chapter in the deep, biochemical transition of the earth. At the lowest level of this aromatic architect lay the foundational scent of the forest floor, the deep, ancient aroma of damp peat and primeval leaf mold. This was the very breath of the earth returning to itself. The millions oak and beet leaves that had fallen over the preceding weeks were undergoing a slow, cold fermentation beneath the weight of the morning dews and late autumn mists. This process released a wealthy, intoxicating perfume that was simultaneously sweet, sharp, and profoundly grounded. It carried the scent of raw vegetable sugars breaking down into rich black humus, a fragrance that felt heavy with the promise of future fertility. To a medieval woodsman like old Aldous, this specific smell was not one of decay, but of ultimate security. It was the scent of a healthy, living soil that was safely insulating the subterranean roots from the oncoming frost. Rising through this foundation layer of earthiness was the distinct, bitter fragrance of wild tannins and wet oak timber. The giant trunks of the centuries-old oak, now completely saturated by the recent rains, released a clean, sharp, astringent aroma from their deeply furrowed bark. This scent was amplified by the hundreds of thousands of broken acorn shells scattered across the foraging grounds. As the swine fractured the mahogany husks to reach the starchy kernels within, the air became saturated with the oily, bittersweet essence of the nut meat, mixed with the sharp, woody perfume of the protective copules. This dominant oak fragrance was occasionally interrupted by a sudden, cooling drift of scent from a nearby hollow, where beds of wild wintergreen and decaying bracken ferns added a faint, herbal crispness to the ambient air. Aldous threw this complex aromatic mist with a steady, knowing grace, his sensitive nose reading the environment as clearly as a scholar might read a beautifully illuminated manuscript. He stopped beside a fallen, decaying log that was entirely encrusted with emerald green tree, moss and small, pale white bracket fungi. He gestured for Bruno to lean close, instructing the boy to look past the physic appearance of the wood and focus entirely on its smell. The decaying timber released a soft, a mixture of old cedar, damp cellulose, and the clean, thread-like essence of subterranean mycelium. This, Aldous explained, was the smell of the forest renewing its woodwork, a slow, silent alchemy that turned the skeletal remains of old trees into a soft, nutrient-rich mattress that would nourish the next generation of oak saplings. Woven into this wild, botanical tapestry were the warm, living scents of the manor herd itself. The 70 swine, moving comfortably through the understory, generated a collective cloud of thermal energy that carried its own distinct olfactory signature. It was an earthy, comforting aroma composed of warm animal bristles, rich leather, and the sweet smell of the starchy mass they had been consuming for weeks. This living musk mingled beautifully with the cold, pristine scent of the northern drafts that occasionally filtered down through the thinning canopy, creating a perfect sensory bridge between the domestic world of the village livestock and the untamed interior of the primeval woods. As the afternoon light began to soften in the pale violet tones of dusk, the olfactory landscape grew even more concentrated, wrapping the herdsmen and their charges in a rich, historical perfume that spoke of warmth, endurance, and the absolute abundance of a well-balanced earth. Several weeks of uninterrupted residency beneath the grand, golden vault of the ancient oak forest had wrought a profound and undeniable physical transformation within the manor's herd. As the late November daylight took on a pale, crystalline quality, casting long, minimalist shadows between the massive timber columns, old Aldous and young Bruno stood together on a low limestone shelf, observing their charges with a quiet, meditative satisfaction. The animals they looked upon were scarcely recognizable as the lean, restless creatures that had stood shivering in the muddy lowland pens of the village at the end of the summer harvest. The absolute abundance of the primeval forest floor, the endless, starky wealth of the acorn drop and the rich, oily kernels of the neighbouring beech. Grooves had performed a spectacular feat of natural alchemy, remodelling the livestock into magnificent living testaments to the seasonal generosity of the earth. Before this great autumn migration, the swine had possessed the sharp, narrow geometry of animals designed for constant, strenuous foraging in a competitive landscape. Their ribs had formed visible ridges beneath their coarse coats, and their movements had been characterized by a frantic, nervous energy driven by the constant undercurrent of hunger. Now, however, their physical forms had expanded into an architecture of absolute abundance and robust health. The hollow spaces along their flanks had completely filled out, replaced by thick, firm, and beautifully rounded layers of solid lard that rippled softly beneath their skin with every measured step they took. Their frames had grown wide and heavy, sitting low to the ground upon legs that had become remarkably muscular and stout from weeks of traversing the undulating ridges of the woodland interior. The very quality of their outer coats had undergone a noticeable evolution. The dry, brittle bristles that had looked dull in the valley pastures had now taken on a wealthy, lustrous sheen that caught the angled lances of the morning sun like polished obsidian and dark tortoise shell. This brilliant gloss was a direct result of the specific chemistry of their woodland diet, the high concentration of specialized vegetable oils and clean fats inherent to the mature oak acorns had saturated their systems, nourishing their skin from within and creating a natural, water-resistant lacquer over their entire bodies. This thick, glistening coat served as a highly efficient defensive shield against the changing elements, allowing the constant drops of condensing river and the occasional flurry of early frost to slide effortless off their rounded backs without ever piercing the warm, insulative layers of fat below. Even more striking than their physical expansion was the profound behavioral calmness that had settled over the entire herd. In the medieval agrarian world, hunger was recognized as the primary source of animal agitation and strife. A herd with empty bellies was allowed. Chaotic assembly, prone to breaking through boundaries and wandering aimlessly in search of sustenance. But here, surrounded by a carpet of mast so deep that it could not be exhausted, the swine had entered a state of serene, near aristocratic tranquility. They moved through the quiet glens with an immense, heavy deliberation, their footsteps slow, rhythmical, and completely unhurried. Their vocalizations had shifted from the high, demanding squeals of the early autumn to a series of low, synchronized, and comforting murmurs, a deep, rhythmic chorus of guttural sighs that drifted through the timber columns like a tenuous hymn of absolute contentment. Old Aldous rested his chin upon his gnarled hands at the top of his ash stave, his quiet gaze tracking the movements of the old lid sow. She had grown so beautifully round and heavy that she resembled a small, dark boulder moving smooth through the bronze sea of fallen foliage. The old man knew that every inch of fat accumulated by these animals was a direct guarantee of survival for the village families waiting in the valley below. This physical prosperity meant that the upcoming winter would not be an epic of starvation or desperate rationing, but a time of warmth, security, and well-filled larders. The great forest had fulfilled its ancient contract with the human community, providing a wealth that required no ploughing, no sowing, and no bitter labor, only the patient, respectful guidance of the herdsman under the timeless, sheltering canopy of the sacred oak. As the deep mid-hours claimed the high ridges above the Rhine basin, the celestial sphere underwent a magnificent progression, lifting a brilliant, late autumn moon into the vast, unblemished dome of the nocturnal sky, stripped of the soft, humid hazes that had cushioned the warm summer evenings. The November air possessed a pristine, ice-chilled clarity that sharpened the visage of the moon into a radiant medallion of pure, polished silver. Its brilliant celestial beacon climbed slowly, deliberately along its path, casting an immense, cool luminescence across the undulating expanse of the woodland realm. Because the recent frosts and rhythmic autumn rains had stripped the great oaks of their dense outer layers of foliage, the architecture of the canopy had grown open and transparent, allowing the lunar light to perform a breathtaking transformation of the interior landscape. The silver beams did not merely filter through the ceiling, they sliced cleanly and dramatically through the wide gaps in the branches, descending like immense, luminous columns of white fire that reached all the way from the heavens to the damp earth below. This stark, monochrome illumination completely remodeled the visual character of the glen, turning the familiar golden-brown sanctuary of the daytime into a grand, open-air cathedral of silver and shadow. The massive, centuries-old oak trunks stood like monumental pillars of dark basalt or cold granite, their rough, furrowed bark catching the light on their eastern flanks, while their western sides dissolved completely into deep, velvets of pure darkness. Overhead, the compassed lattice of bare twigs and gnarled limbs cast an intricate, shifting pattern of black lace across the forest floor, creating a magnificent, geometric tapestry that danced in slow synchronization with the subtle currents of the upper air. Young Bruno sat near the threshold of the leaf hut, his knees drawn up to his chest beneath the heavy warmth of his wool cloak, his eyes tracking the slow, silent journey of the moonlight across the mossy ground. The world lost all its varied daytime hues, narrowing down to a beautiful, binary landscape of brilliant ivory and profound obsidian, where a silver beam struck an exposed patch of the secret limestone stream. The water did not merely shimmer, it burned with a cold, liquid fire, reflecting the lunar disk with such flawless precision that the pool seemed to contain a second moon trapped with its transparent depths. The cushions of hair-capped moss, saturated with the previous day's dampness, took on a frosty, diamond-like brilliance under the direct rays, every microscopic droplet of condensation glistening like a tiny, scattered star. Beneath this magnificent, celestial vault, the manor herd slept in a state of absolute, moonlit peace. Nestled within the massive, buttressed hollows of the oak roots, their dark, heavy bodies were partially illuminated by the passing lances of silver light, their coarse bristles catching the radiance and turning them into shimmering, metallic contours against the dark loam. The animals were completely synchronized with the deep silence of the night, their breathing slow, regular, and heavy, creating small, rhythmic plumes of pale white mist that rose in the cold air before dissolving in the silver shadows. There was no sound of movement, no rustle of unease. The profound security of their full bellies and the sheltering embrace of the ancient trees had wrapped them in a cloak of total rest. Aldous remained awake for a few moments longer, his back resting against the solid timber of the white oak, his weathered fist bathed in the cool, soft light of the midnight sky. He looked up through the skeletal framework of the canopy, reading the position of the stars with the effortless familiarity of a traveller who knew every milestone on an ancient road. The moon had reached its zenith, transforming the wilderness into a space of sacred, quiet majesty, far removed from the shifting politics and temporary struggles of the mortal world below. In this timeless hour, the forest felt eternal, an unshakable temple of nature that had witnessed 1,000 such nights and would witness 1,000 more. The young apprentice felt his eyes growing heavy, his thoughts gently losing their sharp edges as they melted into the rhythmic, silent harmony of the silver woods, fully anchored to the comforting, enduring peace of the ancient landscape. While old Aldous and young Bruno maintained their silent vigil under the moonlit cathedral of the oak forest, a parallel rhythm of quiet, industrious preparation was unfolding within the timbered walls of the Valley Manor House. Down in the Rhine lowlands, Mistress Isella directed the seasonal transition of the domestic estate with the steady, practice authority of a woman who measured the passage of time by the fullness of her storage bins and the warmth of her hearths. The manor's central hall, a vast space defined by heavy, soot-blackened oak rafters, had transformed into bustling sanctuary of winter preservation. The air here was warm and thick, completely saturated with a complex, comforty aroma of burning beech log, dried meadow herbs, and the rich, oily scent of rendered tallow. High above, suspended from the dark timber beams out of reach of the hearth sparks, hung dozens of carefully braided bundles of wild garlic, golden onions, dried marjoram, and pungent thyme, their withered leaf releasing a faint, savoury perfume whenever the warm air currents shifted through the room. At the centre of La's immediate focus was the preparation of the estate's preserving agents, most notably the precious stores of white salt that had been transported up the Rhine by regional merchants during the final weeks of navigable summer water. Inside the dry, stone-lined cellar of the manor, she stood before a series of massive, hollowed-out lindenwood troughs filled to the brim with coarse salt crystals. Gisela reached her hand into the cool, mineral wealth, lifting a handful of the white grains and allowing them to trickle slowly between her fingers back into the bin. The sound was like a miniature cascade of dry gravel, a clean, sharp rustle that filled the quiet cellar. These crystals, harvested from the saline springs of the eastern lowlands, were rough and irregular, catching the faint, amber light of a tallow candle like tiny, unpolished gemstones. Every grain represent a vital shield against the creeping forces of winter spoilage, an indispensable tool that would soon lock in the rich nutrients of the forest-fattened herd. Outside the main hall, tucked away near the edge of the kitchen garden where the residual summer soil lay dark and empty, stood the manor's dedicated smokehouse. This small, windowless structure was built of heavy river stones and thick layers of insulating clay plaster, designed to maintain a perfectly controlled interior environment. Inside, the walls were coated in a thick, glossy layer of dark creosote, a testament to decades of seasonal curing. Gisela inspected the lower stone hearths where the fires would soon be kindled. For this delicate process, the village woodsmen had gathered specific piles of green oak sawdust, dried juniper branches, and seasoned beech logs, avoiding any resinous pines that would impart a bitter taste to the meat. The cold smoke generated by these specific woods would rise slow through the high racks, bathing the preserved provisions in a thick, fragrant cloud that would dry the tissues, infuse them with wildwood phenols, and protect them from the damp winter wrought for many months to come. Back in the main kitchen area, the domestic tools were being prepared with a slow, methodical care. Large iron cauldrons and wide copper vat, pollel shine with river sand and wood ash paste, sat in clean rows upon the wooden benches, ready for the intense labour that would follow the herd's return. Several women of the manor sat quietly in the soft light near the hearth, their hands moving with an automatic, rhythmic precision as they spun sheep's wool using heavy clay drop spindles. The soft, tenuous whirring of the spinning spindles blend seamlessly with the gentle crackle of the fire, creating a soothing, hypnotic background noise that anchored the domestic space. Gisela moved among them, her heavy linen apron rustling softly against the parquet floor. There was no haste in her movements, only the calm, unshakable confidence of a community that had aligned its lifestyle perfectly with the seasonal offerings of the earth. The village was ready, the firewood was stacked high on the lean-to roofs. The salt was ground, and the smokehouses stood clean and waiting for the final, triumphant return of the swineherds from the ancient woods. The atmospheric conditions over the high ridges of the Rhine Valley underwent another definitive shift as the true heralds of winter began to arrive from the polar north. The low, pearl-grey clouds that had cushioned the valley for days suddenly fractured, swept away by a powerful, biting wind that carried a pristine, sub-zero clarity. This new wind did not whisper through the canopy, it whistled with a low, hollow resonance through the open columns of the timber, sounding like the distant blowing of a great horn across an empty plain. The ambient temperature dropped rapidly, locking the moisture of the recent rains into a thin, glassy veneer of ice that coated the northern sides of the massive oak trunk. Under the pressure of this freezing draft, the grand, multi-tiered architecture of the forest canopy completed its seasonal surrender, shedding its remaining garments of rust and deep bronze in a final, dramatic flurry of falling leaves. With the arrival of this heavy frost, the great seasonal phenomenon of the acorn drop, the traditional acorn that had sustained the manor herd for weeks, reached its natural conclusion. For nearly a month, the forest floor had been a vibrant, active banquet table, filled with the continuous, rhythmic percussion of ripe nuts tumbling through the foliage. Now, the high branches stood almost entirely bare, their dark, skeletal forms etched with absolute precision against the pale, ice blue of the winter sky. The thousands of woody cupules that had held the acorns securely through the summer storms now gripped nothing but empty air, their interiors white and dried by the frost. The very last few acorns, frozen on their stems at the highest tips of the giant white oaks, finally detached under the weight of the northern wind. They plunged through the empty grid of branches, landing not with the soft, muffled thud of the early autumn, but with a sharp, brittle clack as they struck the hardened, frosty crust of the ground. This massive, cementation shedding of leaves had created a magnificent, monumental feature upon the woodland topography, a thick, dense, and uniform insulating carpet that completely covered the forest floor. This leaf blanket was nearly a foot deep in the hollows, composed of billions of individual oak and beech leaves that had settled into a tightly packed, felted mattress of bronze, mahogany, and iron grey, compressed by the recent rains and sealed on top by the nightly frosts. This natural thatch functioned as an incredibly efficient thermal barrier for the earth below. It was a manifestation of nature's protective architecture. While the air above the leaves was freezing and hostile, the soil beneath the thick golden carpet remained unfrozen, dark, and warm. This deep insulation trapped the residual heat of the subterranean loam, protecting the delicate root systems of the ancient trees from the deadly grip of the deep winter freeze and preserving the rich micro-life of the soil until the distant spring awakening. Young Bruno walked along the edge of the ridge, noticing how the sensory character of his movements had been altered by the frost. His leather boots no longer sank into a soft, damp cushion of loam instead. Every step produced a crisp, metallic snap as the frozen moisture on the surface of the leaves fractured beneath his weight. The air he inhaled was so cold and clean that it caused a sharp tingling in his chest, his breath forming long, thick plumes of white vapor that drifted lazily by him like trailing silk ribbons. Beside him, old Aldous stood at the vanguard of the ridge, his heavy wool cloak pinned tightly against his throat with a hand-carved bone brooch to repel the biting wind. The old master swineherd looked out over the transformed glen. His experienced eyes recognized that the great woodland pantry was officially closing its doors for the year. There was no anxiety in the old man's heart, for the work had been fully accomplished. Below them, nestled in the deep, protected hollows between the buttressed roots of the great white oak, the manor herd lay in a state of absolute, profound contentment. The swine were tucked away beneath the edges of the thick leaf blanket, their rounded, fat-laden bodies generating a collective pool of warmth that kept the frost at bay. They were so well fed, so completely saturated by the starky wealth of the mature mass, that they showed no desire to forage or wander. The long migration under the golden canopy had done its magnificent work. The lean animals of the late summer had been transformed into heavy, robust assets, ready to secure the economic survival of the entire manor through the dark months ahead. The cycle of the forest drop was complete, leaving the wilderness wrapped in a silent, freezing peace that stood as a shield over the sleeping earth. The final morning of the autumn residency broke over the high ridges with a pristine, silent majesty. The sky painted in a uniform shade of cool slate grey that offered no hint of the distant sun. The northern wind had softened into gentle, circulating draft that carried the clean, sharp scent of frozen pine needles and brittle oak bark. Throughout the vast, open-air cathedral of the woodland interior, a profound stillness reigned, an absolute quietude so deep that the snapping of a single frosted twig half a mile away would have echoed like a sharp command. Nestled within the massive, buttressed root systems of the giant white oaks, the manor herd remained completely hidden from view, tucked safely away beneath the deep, insulating blanket of bronze and gold leaves they had gathered around them for warmth. They were completely motionless, their bodies heavy and saturated with weeks of rich, starky acorn mast, drifting in a state of profound, undisturbed rest. Old Aldous stood upon the highest crest of the limestone ridge, his silhouette etched with crisp precision against the pale northern horizon. He knew that the time had arrived to close this chapter of the agrarian year, to gather his charges from the secret corners of the wilderness and guide them back toward the valley manor. Reaching beneath the thick folds of his wool cloak, his weathered fingers found a familiar, comforting object hanging from a braided hemp cord against his chest. This his traditional herdsman's horn, a primitive but highly efficient instrument carved decades ago from the curved horn of a mountain ox. The surface of the horn was smooth, polished to a dull, milky, white sheen by the continuous friction of his palm, its dark tip bound in a simple band of hammered iron to prevent splitting. It was an object that carried the memories of many autumn migrations, a physical link between generations of swineherds who had navigated these same uncharted timbers. With a slow, deliberate movement that possessed the unhurried grace of a ritual, the old man brought the horn to his lips. He drew the crisp, ice air of the November dawn deep in his lungs, his chest expanding beneath his wool tunic, and blew a single, long, sustained note in the quiet grooves. The sound that emerged was not a sharp, startling blast designed to cause panic or alarm. Instead, it was magnificent, low-frequency drone, a deep, resonant vibrato that seemed to mimic the natural acoustics of the forest itself. It was a sound that belonged to the landscape, vibrating soft through the columns of timber, echoing off the limestone cliffs, and penetrating deep in the subterranean hollows where the animals lay sleeping. The note held a heavy, ancient quality, a wordless command that had signaled the end of the harvest season for 1,000 years. As the echoes of the horn slowly dissolved in the misty horizons, the immense blank of fallen leaves began to stir with a sudden, localized movement. From beneath the bronze cushions, a long, grey-bristled snout emerged, casting aside a flurry of frosted leaves with a quiet rustling sound. It was the old lead sow, her sensed ears twitching at the familiar call that had guided her since youth. She let out a low, communicative runt, a deep, guttural sigh that vibrated through the crisp morning air like a signal of obedience. Hearing her response, the rest of the herd began to awaken, the ground itself appearing to rise and fall as 70 heavy, round animals emerged from their warm earth cocoons. They stood up slowly, shaking the dry foliage from their lustrous, fat-laden backs, their bodies wide and stable upon legs that had grown remarkably strong from weeks of forest ranging. Young Bruno stood at the base of the ridge, his ash stave resting lightly against his shoulder as he watched the magnificent reassembly of the herd. One by one, moving with a heavy, dignified deliberation, the swine began to walk toward the center of the glen, drawn by the irresistible magnetism of the old lead sow and the lingering resonance of the horn. There was no chaos, no frantic rushing. The animal moved in an orderly, single-file line, their small hooves clicking softly against the hardened earth in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. They gathered in a tight, peaceful cluster around old Aldous, their warm breath rising in the cold air in thick, synchronade plumes of white vapour that mingled with the low, hanging morning clouds. The call had been answered perfectly. The old swineherd lowered his horn, let it rest once more against his chest, his serene eyes scanning the robust, healthy assembly that stood ready for the journey home, fully anchored to the comforting, enduring discipline of the ancient custom. The steady, rhythmic resonance of the herdsman's horn had barely dissolved in the misty horrors of the lower valley when a solitary figure materialized from the frost-silvered fringes of the western beech grove. It was Warden Wolfram, the forest overseer, forming his final administrative duties of the autumn season, with the same unhurried, monumental precision that had characterized his initial welcome at the forest gate. His heavy wool cloak of deep woodland green was stiff with the morning rime, its edges frosted into delicate, glittering patterns that mirrored the skeletal lace of the overhanging branches. In his right hand, he held his notched oak measuring rod, and from his leather belt hung the master pouch containing the village tally sticks. His approach was entirely silent. His leather boots move across the frozen, packed leaf carpet without, producing a single disrupt sound, allowing the absolute peace of the morning to remain unbroken. The final inspection was a vital legal mechanism of the 10th century manor, a former process that brought structural closure to the weeks of natural foraging. Wolfram came to a gentle halt a few paces from old Aldous, his calm, discerning gaze sweeping over the gathered livestock. There was an immediate expression of profound professional satisfaction on the warden's weathered face. He looked upon a herd that had achieved the pinnacle of physical readiness. The 80s stood in a dense, quiet cluster, their bodies remarkably broad, rounded, and dense with high-quality fat built from the starky wealth of the mature oak math. Their skin was healthy, their dark bristly coats glistening with a natural protective lacquer that repelled the freezing air. They stood perfectly stable, their low, rhythmic breathing creating a collective cloud of white vapour that rose like a monument of warmth into the grey morning sky. Aldous reached in the interior pocket of his heavy wool tunic, his calloused fingers retrieving his half of the split beechwood tally stick, the legal passport that had guarded their residency beneath the canopy. He extended his hand, presenting the carved wood to the warden. Wolfram drew the matching master half from his leather pouch, and under the pale, ambient light of the winter dawn, the two men held the pieces together. With a slow, deliberate movement, they aligned the grain of the wood, fitting the two halves back into a single, cohesive twig. The individual notches that had been carved at the customary stone weeks earlier matched flawlessly, a physical proof that the contract had been executed with absolute honesty, balance, and respect for the traditional laws of the forest ecosystem. No unauthorized animals had been introduced, and the ecological boundaries of the manor had been strictly preserved. With the verification of the tally sticks complete, Wolfram began the formal count of the livestock, a task requiring immense patience and quiet observation. He walked a slow circle around the perimeter of the resting herd, using the tip of his oak measuring rod to gently count each animal as it stood under shelter of the white oak. The swine remained completely cooperative and serene, their full bellies rendering them entirely immune to the anxieties of movement. Wolfram noted the exceptional volume of each animal, reckoning that the tithe of the mast, the percentage of the fattened herd, that would be rendered to the Lord's winter larders would be of unprecedented quality, ensuring the security of the entire estate. He took his utility knife, placing a final, deep horizontal score across the joined tally sticks to signify that the seasonal clearance had been granted. The legal threshold had been successfully closed. Wolfram returned the master stick to his pouch and extended his arm in a traditional gesture of safe passage, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that wished the herdsmen clear tracks and warm hearths upon their return to the valley. The ancient forest had fulfilled its part of the primordial contract, delivering its boundless starchy wealth to the human community without losing its own internal vitality. Aldous in quiet gratitude, securing his piece of the carved beechwood back in his clothing like a treasured artifact. The journey through the uncharted timber was finished. The grand architecture of the oak canopy had safely protected them through the changing of the epochs, and now the wide agricultural lowlands of the Rhine waited to welcome them home. As we prepare to follow the herd out of these timeless grooves, if you have enjoyed this peaceful voyage through history, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a gentle like, and sharing these quiet narratives with fellow travelers who seek a restful haven in the stories of old. With the final clearance from Warden Wolfram officially granted and the legal tally sticks safe secured, old Aldous raised his heavy ash stave, gesturing toward the downward path that wound along the eastern flank of the limestone ridge. The old led so, understanding the silent command with the flawless intuition of her years, turned her massive, rounded frame away from the shelter of the monumental white oak and began a slow, deliberate march toward the edge of the woodland. The remaining 79 swine fell into a comfortable, single file line behind her, their bodies wide, heavy, and completely stable upon legs that had grown exceptionally strong from weeks of ranging. The long, triumphant march out of the 10th century wilderness had begun, marking the formal transition from the sacred, vertical sanctuary of the ancient forest back to the horizontal expanse of the domestic agrarian world. The physical descent from the high ridges brought a gradual but distinct transformation in the environmental landscape. As the herd moved lower, the density of the centuries-old oaks began to thin, their massive timber columns giving way to smaller clusters of silver birch, hardy hazel bushes, and frozen hornbeam hedges that mark the historical boundaries of the manor lands. The protective, multi-layered canopy that had served as an immense living umbrella for a month slowly opened up, revealing the vast, pale slate grey sky of the early winter morning. The ambient light, which had been filtered and shadowed within the forest interior, expanded into wide, crystalline luminescence that cast no distinct shadows but illuminate the entire Rhine basin with a cold, pristine clarity. Emerging from the final line of boundary trees, the wide, open geography of the lowlands stretched out before the travellers like a beautifully detailed tapestry. The agricultural fields, which had been warm and vibrant with golden stubble when they first departed in October, now lay dormant and quiet, their dark ridges completely dusted with a fine layer of white hoarfrost that glistened under the pale sky like a scattering of fine salt. Far in the distance, the winding ribbon of the Rhine River was visible, its waters shrouded in a low, lazy mist that crept along the willow-lined banks. The sharp, biting northern draught swept unimpeded across the open plains, carrying the distant, comforting scent of wood smoke from the village hearths, a clean aroma that signalled the proximity of warmth and shelter. The auditory character of their journey underwent a profound evolution as the terrain flattened beneath their feet. The soft, muffled thud of hooves stepping upon deep beds of velvet moss and bronze-leaf mould was replaced by a crisp, rhythmic clack-clack as the animals transitioned onto the hardened, frozen clay of the valley tracks. It was a dense, resonant sound, a steady chorus of 80 successful foragers returning from a land of plenty. The swine moved with magnificent, unhurried dignity, their long ears twitching in contentment and their breath forming thick, synchronized plumes of white vapor that drifted lazily over their lustrous, fat-laden backs like trailing banners of silk. Young Bruno walked at the rear of the column, his ash stave resting lightly against his shoulder, his eyes tracking the steady, unbroken line of the livestock. He paused for a brief moment, turning his head to look back up at the high ridges they had just abandoned. The ancient oak forest stood behind them like a dark, monumental wall of silent timber, its bare branches reaching toward the sky in a gesture of eternal permanence. The wilderness had filled its primordial contract with the human community, delivering its boundless starky wealth to secure their survival through the dark months ahead. With a heart filled with a deep, unshakable sense of peace and accomplishment, the young apprentice turned back toward the valley, stepping into the open light of the lowlands as the herd guided them steadily toward the welcome gates of the home manor. The frosted clay track of the lowlands guided the long, orderly column of the manor herd toward the outer perimeter of the human settlement. As the sun climbed slight higher behind its shield of pale slate-grey clouds, casting a soft, uniform light across the landscape, the distant silhouette of the village began to resolve into familiar, comforting shapes. The pointed, straw-thatched roofs of the timber longhouses, heavily dusted with a clean layer of white rime, peered like a cluster of small, snow-capped hills rising from the valley floor. Thick, lazy columns of pale blue wood smoke rose straight into the freezing air from the central hearths, carrying the savory, domestic aroma of boiling, grain and roasting root vegetables, a warm, welcoming signal that reached the travelling herdsmen long before they crossed the threshold of the estate. The distinct, rhythmic sound of the herd approached, the steady, metallic clack-clack of 80 pairs of hooves strike the hardened earth, combined with the deep, synchronized chorus of their contented, guttural murmurs had echoed across the open fields, alerting the village of their imminent return. By the time old Aldous and young Bruno reached the outer boundary ditch, the heavy, iron-bound timber gates of the manor had been thrown wide open. A small, quiet crowd of villagers had gathered along the palisade walls to witness the arrival. There were no loud cheers or boisterous celebrations in the disciplined, cyclical world of the 10th century. The successful completion of the Pannage season was treated with a quiet, profound reverence, a collective sigh of relief that spoke of survival, security, and the preservation of life through the oncoming dark months. Mistress Gisella stood at the vanguard of the gatehouse, her heavy woolen apron tucked neatly into her belt, her sharp but kindly eyes scanning the advancing livestock with the expert precision of an estate manager. As the old lead so crossed the threshold of the gate, her massive, rounded frame appearing beautifully wide and robust under the morning light, Jesla offered a slow, deliberate nod of approval. The visual transformation of the herd was absolute. The lean, restless swine that had left the village a month ago returned as magnificent, heavy testaments to the forest's ancient bounty. Their flanks were wide and beautifully curved, their dark coats glistening with a wealthy, oily lacquer that repelled the frosty air, and their movements were characterized by an immense, lazy dignity that could only be achieved through weeks of uninterrupted feasting upon the starky wealth of the mature oak mast. The children of the village peered fearlessly from behind the wooden posts, their eyes wide with wonder as they watched the heavy animals fly past in perfect, unhurried order. The pigs paid them no mind, moving with a benevolent indifference that demonstrated their complete contentment. For the elder weavers and labourers who sat near the shelter of the granary walls, the sight of this prosper herd was a direct guarantee of economic safety. It meant that the upcoming winter would not be a time of bitter rationing or desperate hunger, but a season of well-filled larder, rich stews, and firm hay lard that would sustain their bodies against the freezing northern winds. The natural alchemy of the ancient fortress had successfully converted the wild, fallen fruit of the sky into tangible shield of survival for the entire human community. Old Aldous stepped through the gates, his heavy ash stave resting firmly against the ground with every measured stride. He stopped before Mistress Gisela, his weathered face illuminated by a quiet, serene satisfaction. No elaborate words were exchanged between them. The old swineherd simply presented his half of the notched beechwood tally stick, now bearing the final, validated score marks of Warden Wolfram. Gisela reached out, her calloused fingers touching the carved wood briefly before offering the traveller a simple, heavy earthenware mug of warm, spiced barley ale to ward off the chill of the road. Bruno followed closely behind his master, his chest swelling with a newfound sense of pride and maturity. He was no longer just an untried village boy playing in the margins of the fields. He had walked the uncharted timber corridors, navigated the heavy river mists, and helped guide a great wealth back from the wilderness, earning his rightful place within the eternal, unhurried rhythm of the manor's seasonal life. The long, triumphant journey of the autumn migration reached its absolute completion when the secure walls of the manor's winter barn, deeply cushioned within thick mattresses of dry and sweet summer hay, the 80 swine nestled together in warm, heavy clusters, their breathing slow, regular, and perfectly peaceful. They had no further need to wander or brave the chilling valley elements. Their bodies were magnificently round and insulated by weeks of feasting upon the starchy wealth of the mature oak mast. The domestic world had successfully locked in its winter security, leaving the herdsmen to finally rest their weary ash staves by the glowing embers of the longhouse hearth. With the human community safely provided for, the visual perspective of the landscape drifted away from the valley tracks, returning quietly to the high, solitary ridges of the primeval wilderness. Up in the uncharted timber corridors where old Aldous and young Bruno had maintained their silent vigil, a profound, sacred stillness claimed the earth. The biting northern wind died away to a whisper, and the vast, slate-grey sky hung low over the canopy like a heavy woolen blanket. Then, with an elegant, unhurried grace, the first true snowflakes of the winter season began to fall. They did not arrive as a blinding blizzard, but as large, solitary crystals drifting lazily through the crisp, frozen air, descending like a silent benediction over the sleeping forest floor. The transformation of the woodland interior was instantaneous and breathtaking. The pristine white flakes gathered slowly along the rough, deeply furrowed bark of the centuries-old oaks, highlighting the intricate, twisting patterns of their ancient growth. The grand, skeletal lattice of the bare canopy, now entirely stripped of its golden and bronze autumn foliage, was gradually coated in a fine, glittering layer of silver rime. Every gnarled branch, empty acorn cupule, and frozen twig was soft-traced in pure white, turning the vast hymn columns into magnificent, open-air temple of ice and shadow. Below, the thick, foot-deep carpet of fallen leaves was covered by a smooth, unblemished shroud of snow, sealing the rich subterranean loam and the dormant spring seeds beneath an impenetrable thermal barrier. This gentle snowfall marked the formal closing of the ancient world's annual cycle. The great forest had fulfilled its primordial contract with the manor, pouring out its boundless natural wealth to protect the community from winter's harshness, and now it was entering its own well-earned epoch of deep regeneration. Standing bare, silent, and monumental against the pale winter sky, the sacred oak stood as symbols of absolute permanence, ready to sleep through the dark frost until the distant, inevitable awakening of the spring sun. The wilderness was at peace, wrapped in a blanket of pristine white silence that guarded the eternal rhythms of the earth. The channel History Under Moonlight is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales, gently curated and narrated based on themes such as the rise and fall of nations, human cultures, and extraordinary journeys through time.